This story begins in a time when people live in space and several galaxies other than Earth. A team of bounty hunters known as the S-Devil come to a location in search of someone, but they're surprised to find that the planet is full of radiation and toxic waste, which means the man they're looking for can't be there. Their leader, Seryung the Blazing Devil, who also doubles as the ship's captain, asks her android assistant, Sunja, who flies their aircraft, if they're in the wrong place. Sunja tells her that they got the correct planet number as given to them by the client, and it's the right location. Sunja expressionlessly explains that they have arrived at the exact destination they had set out to come. The android stops the ship midair and explains that they've arrived at the planet Earth, which was where they set out to go in the first place. Seryung becomes angry and calls out to another member of the team, Robert, and calls him a thief for supplying her wrong intel. Robert peers at the planet from the ship's windows and realizes that something is strange. He says he's sure that this is the right place, but he also looks confused as to how the planet Earth has come to be so inhabitable and full of radiation. Seryung glares at him and mentions that the place is drenched in radiation and doesn't have the faintest trace of oxygen. She asks him how it's possible that there's a high-value criminal hiding there. Robert just keeps looking at the planet through the glass, unsure of what to say. The captain mentions that it's not only absurd that a high-value criminal will be hiding in an uninhabitable pool of radiation, but also that he's a high-ranking member of a gang known as the Black Blood Gang. Robert just looks at her and hesitantly affirms that this seems to be the case. Seryung becomes more mad and starts to curse, but he confesses that it's true even though it doesn't seem like it. Robert explains that he got the intel when someone named Hao Moon raided the main system of the Beggars sect, which means it must be very credible. Seryung looks over at Sunja, who is monitoring activities on the planet, and asks what she thinks. Sunja starkly tells her that if their target came here, it would only be to commit suicide. She explains that the oxygen saturation of the planet is 23.76%, and the radiation contamination level is as high as 87 sieverts, which makes it perfect for killing oneself. Seryung becomes less hopeful by her response, and asks her if it's possible for a human to live there at all. Sunja explains that if such a human has a top-notch radiation shield installed and a high-capacity internal energy drive that spans multiple cycles, they would have a chance. But by having a chance, she explains that she meant they would last for about 6 hours tops before they died. The captain just stares at her blankly, since that wasn't the response she expected. Their trip is looking like more of a waste of time at the moment. Seryung glares at Robert and tells him she'll give him the benefit of the doubt. She asks him what he will do if they go down to the planet and find nothing. She asks him if he'll risk his life to pay for it. Robert stumbles backwards upon hearing her question, and asks if she's insinuating that he sacrifice his life just like that. The captain exclaims and tells him they'll go check it out. She threatens that they had better find their target there because if he's not there, he can be sure he's dead meat. Robert tries to brighten the situation, and he says that Sunja mentioned that she has detected a human life signal below the surface of the planet, but Seryung just gets more irritated. Seryung and Robert create a portal to gain entrance into the destitute and abandoned Earth. Sunja reads out the coordinates of the life form detected on the Earth and sends them there. She explains to them through the communication device that in the past, the place they're standing in was called Mount Tai. True to its name, it's a medieval place that's built on a mountain. Seryung and Robert just stand there, looking at how much of a mess it has become. Seryung is surprised to hear the name and asks Sunja if it's the same popular Mount Tai they all know about. Sunja affirms her suspicions and tells her that it's the very place the old farts from the Martial Alliance called a legendary sanctuary. It's also the origin of the Mount Tai star system. Seryung is surprised to hear the place has an affiliation to the grand people who made the Martial Alliance, which is an alliance that was created to maintain intergalactic peace, and wonders why their so-called legendary sanctuary looks like a trash dump. The captain refers to the men who created the Martial Alliance as old geezers. She wonders why they don't do some cleaning in their sanctuary since they make so much money. Robert tells her that they're all talk and no action. He further explains that they don't put their hands into anything that doesn't make them money, which intrigues Seryung. As they keep working, Sunja tells them that they've gotten to the spot where she detected some life. It turns out to be an empty mass of land covered with sand and trash. Seryung asks her if she's sure because there's nothing there. Sunja tells her she's sure and informs her that there's something or someone alive right beneath their feet. The captain just stares at the ground, wondering how it's even possible for a person to still be alive while buried underground. She bends forward and feels the ground, wondering if she should set up the energy explosion right where they're standing. Robert asks her what she's talking about and what she's planning to do. Seryung doesn't answer him and just asks if whatever is down there is alive. She suddenly activates the energy from the internal energy drive she has strapped to her waist to channel the energy required to blow the ground open. An energy drive is some sort of contraption that allows humans to use ancient martial energy. As the internal energy drive begins to fill her up with power, a streak of green energy starts to surround her and cover where she's crouched. Seryung reasons that she would have long suffocated if she was the one buried that deep in the ground. She gives a command to channel the energy to the ground, and her eyes light up. The martial arts energy sets off an explosion that tunnels through the ground beneath them, expunging a mass of sand that's blocking their path. Some of the sand covers up Robert, who was just standing there, unaware that she planned to blow up the ground. Still, covered in the sand, he glumly tells her to maybe give him a heads up next time so he can get out of the way. The captain just looks into the hole with a disturbed look on her face, wondering if there's really anything under all this sand. She and Robert just stand in front of the large hole, wondering what to do next. The captain signals to Sunja and asks her if there's still any signs of life beneath them, hoping she hasn't blasted the person to bits. Sunja tells her that she's getting a faint signal, but there's still signs of life right beneath them. She adds that there's also a pretty large space down below, which indicates that there is some sort of underground facility there. Robert suggests that they bring down the electronic ladder to climb down the hole. Before he can finish his sentence, Seryung leaps right into the hole, which startles him. Robert just looks at her and jokes that she's always so hot-tempered. Meanwhile, Seryung leaps through the hole and tells Robert to follow her. She soon lands at the end of the hole, with Robert landing right behind her, wondering what kind of maniac he has for a boss. They immediately run into a large door with some ancient inscription written all over it. The direct translation of the inscription on the door is a statement by one Lee Mokjin, which reads like this: "The world fears me and has imprisoned me with the great dharma of esoteric teachings. If you clumsily try to awaken me, death will greet you first." Robert stares at the ancient text and wonders what it says. The captain signals to Sunja to translate the text using her advanced AI capabilities. Sunja tells them that it's an ancient language used over 2,000 years ago, and it roughly means, "Don't open if you don't want to die." Robert becomes excited by the translation and affirms that his intelligence was right after all, because only their target could have put a written threat there. Seryung asks him why their target would write his threat in an ancient language that no one understands. Robert just stutters and mentions that it could be possible that he's the guy they're looking for. The captain tells him that they can't be certain, but in any case, it's a good sign since they're threatening them not to open it. She starts to make her way towards the door, and says that the threat must mean that there's something valuable inside. She places her hands on the door, and they both hear a loud sound. Suddenly, the door opens on its own accord. The duo just stand there, perplexed. They continue their journey and step into an underground facility that seems to look like a temple. On a podium up front, a large creature that looks like a fur beast or a mass of hair just sits there. But before you hear the rest of this exciting story, I invite you to check out my second channel, where you can find some extended videos from the main channel, which I can't publish here due to copyright. New videos will be released here as well, so subscribe to don't miss it. You can find link in the description. The creature seems to have human legs, but its entire body region is covered up by long, furry hair. Robert quickly sees it and wonders what it is. He notices that it looks human, but the rest of it doesn't look human at all. Seryung just stares at the creature blankly, looking unimpressed by the entire scenery. She boldly walks up the stairs leading to the podium to investigate what the creature is. When she gets to the top of the podium, the creature doesn't move an inch, but just sits there like it's not aware of their presence. When she looks closer, she realizes that he has a nose under the great mass of hair that's covering his head. It seems to be a man after all. But how can a man survive under all that rubble for so long? Robert, who just remains on the ground, asks her if the creature is alive and asks if it's human. He quickly recalls that it's been buried for 2,000 years, and it couldn't possibly be alive. Seryung stares blankly at the immobile creature and wonders what to make of it. The creature just sits there in total silence, and there's no way to tell whether it's dead or alive. She decides to break the ice and reaches out to touch it. She finally places her finger on its nose, hoping to get some sort of response from the creature. The creature still remains immobile even though her finger is on its nose and doesn't give any response at all. Something suddenly happens which starts to freak Seryung out. Suddenly, streaks of purple lightning start to emanate from the spot she touched him, and it looks like she's awakened it. Her eyes widen because she never expected any of this to happen. The creature's eyes begin to burn with a fiery red light, and streaks of purple lightning continue to emanate from its body, and it looks like some Greek god. Seryung suddenly becomes alert and moves backwards, quickly activating a blast of energy through her palm, since she's not sure what the creature is. The creature doesn't move out of the way, but it seems to put an energy field around her palm between itself and Seryung. She becomes surprised by what's happening and lets out the energy beam to destroy it. The surge of energy collides with the field the creature had set up and blows up between them, and it seems much more than what she can contain in such close range. The creature amplifies and redirects the attack. The energy surge fills up the entire underground facility and creates another large hole in the ground right above them. The energy released is so strong that it shoots right into space and goes past the S-Devil aircraft, and even Sunja sees it. The beam misses the craft by just a few meters, and it would have been incinerated if it was parked somewhere else. The energy surge alerts Sunja, who asks them what's going on over the comms. She calls out to the captain to know what's going on and what she did to trigger the energy surge, but she gets no response. Sunja keeps calling out to Seryung and Robert and starts to get worried when she doesn't receive any answer. Meanwhile, while Sunja calls for their attention over the comms, Seryung just lays on the ground several meters from the podium, as it seems the impact of the energy had knocked her a few feet away. Her radiation shield seems to have been slightly broken, and she seems to be bleeding from an injury. Seryung crawls backwards and rests on a nearby wall, still speechless because of what had just happened. A few meters from her, Robert lays on the ground, obviously knocked out by the impact of the blast. Seryung soon locks her gaze on the creature on the podium, who now stands right in front of her. The creature stands upright and walks towards her, looking unscathed by the impact of the blast. The creature asks her who she is, but Seryung just lays there and stares at it, still in shock. The creature asks her who dares awaken him, but he still gets no response from Seryung. Seryung just stares at it blankly, and it seems she doesn't understand what it's saying. She continues to stare at it, unsure of what to do and what the creature is. The creature starts to think to itself if Seryung's rude awakening is a challenge. It questions if a martial artist capable of challenging him has finally been born. Moments pass, and Seryung just sits on the ground, still unsure of what will happen next. Meanwhile, Robert is still out cold and isn't aware of any of the things happening. The creature orders Seryung to speak and give him a response, but it seems like she doesn't understand what he's saying, so she keeps staring at him in bewilderment. The man-like creature rashly insists that she tells him why she has chosen to awaken him. Seryung suddenly becomes angry that she can't understand a word of what he's saying, so she decides to activate her real-time translation mode. The creature raises its hands, and it looks like a man. She hears him threaten to kill her if she doesn't answer his questions, and it seems he doesn't realize that she doesn't speak his language. Seryung becomes alerted by his threat to kill her and tries to get up. As the creature raises up his hands, he repeats his threat to kill her if he doesn't get a response. The captain gets right into action and shoots beams of lightning at him, wondering what kind of monster she's dealing with. The impact of her attack causes another massive explosion that lands right on the creature and exposes it to massive heat. She creates another explosive ball in her hands and tells the creature to die. She keeps throwing series of explosive energy at it, which swallows up the creature till all you can see is fire and smoke, hoping it would die. The entire cave becomes littered with sand that is spilled around by the continuous onslaught of explosive power. Seryung decides to rest for a while after she gets tired from expending so much power. She starts to breathe heavily to calm herself down, and the internal drive system alerts her that she has overloaded the drive because she has used up 1.2 cycles out of the 1.14 that's available. Out of nowhere, the creature appears out of the rubble, totally unscathed, and walks towards her. Meanwhile, Seryung's energy system warns her to recharge her internal energy so she can keep battling. The creature just stands in front of her, and not one hair on it seems to have been affected by all the explosion. The captain looks surprised and wonders how it's still in the same shape after all those hits. The creature analyzes her martial art technique and tells her she used the Quantum Golden Summit Divine Art and the Red Mist Divine Palm. He mentions that though they are the martial art of the Emi sect, he has noticed that it seems to have many impurities, which suggests that she learnt it through theft. He tells her that, in other words, this means that she's just a thief scraping by with skills she acquired from grave robbing, and he looks pissed off. He suddenly starts to levitate off the ground, and a purple light envelopes him, causing a destructive whirlwind to circle through the cave. Seryung just stares at him in horror since she's run out of power to dispense. The creature asks her what effrontery a mere thief has to disrupt his eternal sleep, as his purple energy starts to increase more and more. Seryung continues to stare at him, afraid that he's going to launch an attack to destroy her. He finally declares that she's going to die and proceeds to launch his attack. Something odd happens, which surprises the captain and makes her crash to the ground. The creature falls face flat to the ground, and it seems to be dead. Seryung just watches from afar, wondering what has happened to it. She asks herself what the heck just happened, and watches the creature who seems to have passed out in front of her after threatening to kill her just a few minutes ago. She hears a voice from behind who tells her the creature must have died. It turns out to be Robert, who has finally woken up from his slumber. He tells her it's only natural that it died after being exposed to the radiation on the planet without a shielding field. He wonders how the creature was able to hold out for so long before dying. Sunja suddenly tells them that the creature is still alive because its breathing and pulse are still normal. Robert is surprised and asks her why the creature suddenly collapsed. Sunja runs some analysis and tells him that the creature seems to have collapsed from energy depletion. She further explains that its body is fine, but the battery inside its stomach seems completely drained, which further confuses Robert. Seryung is surprised when she hears that it had fainted due to energy depletion in its stomach. Seryung still crouches close to the wall, drained from the energy she has expended, as she and Robert stare at the immobile creature. She reasons that, in other words, it must have fainted from hunger, which means it was starving from not having eaten for the past 2,000 years. Hours later, the duo return to their aircraft, and Robert protests about something to the captain. He asks why she brought it along into the aircraft, and he screams they should have left it behind, especially because of how dangerous it seemed to be in the cave. He reminds her of how the creature went berserk just moments ago, and how it seems harder to kill it than to kill a cockroach with a nuclear blast. He further mentions that at least a radioactive cockroach would be worth a few bucks, but this crazy monster isn't worth anything to them, and there's no need to carry it along. Meanwhile, they all stare at the immobile creature that Seryung had wrapped in some sort of bind to keep it from moving around. Seryung insists that the creature is worth money. Robert and Sunya just stare at her blankly, wondering what she meant by that. They wait for her to explain, but she just stands there, with the creature still lying in front of them. She continues by saying the creature isn't just worthy money, it's worth lots of it. They both exclaim when she says that, wondering what she means. Seryung asks them what the most valuable cultural heritage they have today is. Sunja answers that the ancient martial arts are the most valuable cultural heritage. She adds that the closer the art is to the original form, the more expensive it is. Seryung agrees and mentions that it's obvious that the fuzzball that they captured is an ancient martial artist from around 2,000 years ago, and no less based on the inscriptions on his cave. She explains that 2,000 years ago was a legendary period when martial arts were highly developed. She says that even the lowest class F-grade techniques from that era can fetch at least 10,000 credits. She also adds that the creature isn't on a low level like F-grade, and he was probably a grandmaster that was at least an S rank or higher. Robert follows her train of thought and blurts out they'd be hitting the jackpot if he truly is S rank. He mentions that the only issue they can have now is if he wakes up on their ship. Seryung tells them not to worry because she tied him with celestial silkworm threads that are used in spaceship repairs. She gloats that even the head of the Shaolin sect couldn't cut it if he wanted to. Seconds later, they hear a ripping sound, and Seryung stops talking when she realizes what just happened. She glances behind her, hoping it's not what she thinks. When she looks back, the creature has easily ripped her treasured celestial silkworm threads like a polythene wrapper. He just stands there staring at them. He continues his threats by asking what effrontery lowly grave robbers like them have to desecrate him. He starts to burn in fiery anger again and threatens to tear them to shreds. The captain starts to curse in anger as she brings out her sword because she didn't expect him to set himself free so easily, and Robert starts to blame her because he had told her this would happen. While they prepare to fight him, they're surprised by what happens next. As the creature lights up in a blazing glory and prepares to incinerate them, Sunja walks in front of him with a plate filled with grilled hot dogs. The hot dogs look so appealing, and the aroma fills up the atmosphere in the spaceship. Robert and Seryung watch in surprise as things quickly turn around. Unlike what they expected, the creature quickly ignores the fight and starts to gobble up the plate of hot dogs like a madman. All three of them watch as the creature sits on their table and frantically swallows the hot dogs, ignoring their presence. The captain asks Sunja how she knew that would work. Sunja just tells them it was obvious since he's been starving for a very long time. She explains that the best thing for any hungry beast is a sausage. They can only manage to exclaim at Sunja's intelligence and quick thinking. Meanwhile, the ship remains suspended close to planet Earth, where they had just left moments ago. A few moments later, the creature has a civilized discussion with the S-Devil bounty hunters. He recounts what they had told him, that they aren't grave robbers, but just bounty hunters who accidentally woke him up. Just to get things right, he also asks that they had said that this world is the world 2,000 years after his time, where humans had gone further in their desires to harm each other. Thereby, they destroyed the world and have decided to live in the skies. Seryung tells him that things have stabilized ever since then, because the humans decided not to allow any weapons apart from martial arts, including nuclear weapons. Our guy just asks what nuclear weapons are, since he's about 2,000 years old and doesn't know what nuclear weapons are. Still confused, he asks the bounty hunters what the current era is called. Seryung asks him what he means, because they no longer refer to times as eras anymore. She tells him it's the year 1105 in the galactic calendar. The creature asks them why they're using the galactic year and sarcastically asks them if they also live in the sky, because their story seems like a pill too hard to swallow. They think he's starting to understand his story, so Seryung tells him that they woke him up after 2,000 years and he should be immensely grateful. The creature becomes irritated by her words and story and calls it nonsense. He asks who she thinks she's talking to, and if she even knows who he is. He insists that they're third-rate grave robbers, and they're trying to deceive him with their nonsensical stories. He starts to burn up again in anger, and he asks them if they wish to die by lying to him. The three bounty hunters simply point to the nearby window on the ship, signaling for him to look for himself. He quickly turns around and looks at what they're pointing at. The creature becomes transfixed, and he's shocked at what he sees. Out of the window, a view of the radiation-filled Earth, along with the sun, which floats in a distance, is clear. Se-ryung tells him to look closely at the place over there, referring to him as Fuzzball, then correcting herself, and referring to him as Grandpa and Master. She tells him the planet right in front of them is where he lived. He looks at the radiation-filled Earth and asks if that's really the world he lived in, shocked at how things have become. The captain replies with an affirmation and tells him it's totally ruined now, as the creature moves toward the window to get a closer look. She tries to comfort him and asks him if he now believes they're saying the truth now that he's seen it for himself. He suddenly starts to burn again, and he states that even if he wants to believe, they surely don't expect him to believe that the land he was standing on is round. The captain just hits her head, wondering how astonishingly ignorant he must be. Robert just stares at them in surprise. The smell of the creature's hair and stinking body fills the ship, and the captain starts to wonder where the terrible smell is coming from. She quickly covers her nose and tells him that he'll learn the rest later, but asks him to take a shower first and maybe trim his hair since they're going to be staying together for a while anyway. Our guy just asks what they mean by shower since they never had showers in this civilization. Se-ryung makes it clearer and tells him to go take a bath. The three bounty hunters wait outside their restroom while the new guy takes a shower in their bathroom. Inside, the creature enjoys the shower time and takes his precious time since he's too old to be rushed anyway. While he has a bath, they leave a couple of clothes on the ground for him to wear when he's done. Robert asks the captain why she didn't just leave the guy's hair as it was. Meanwhile, the guy cuts all his hair off, and it piles up on the ground. Robert shares his concerns with the captain that he's worried that some mummified creature will come out of the bathroom since the guy has cut off all his hair. Robert stops mid-sentence to look at the new guy, who had just stepped out of the bathroom, and Se-ryung also freezes. The new guy steps out looking much cleaner with water dripping from his body. He cleans his hair with a hot towel, and his exposed body shows that he's not a monster after all, but he looks human. He removes the towel out of the way to expose a gorgeous young face with black earrings and a muscular toned body. He doesn't notice the fact that the three of them just stand there looking at him speechless, and he asks them if there's still more of what he ate earlier. Se-ryung stares at him wide-eyed because she was expecting a grumpy-looking old creature and not such an attractive person. She wonders who this guy could be. Later, the ship continues its course through space and leaves the area around the Earth to go somewhere else. The new guy just glues to the windows and stares at all the celestial bodies, since it's his first time seeing them this close. He thinks to himself that this seems to be the sky after all, and they weren't lying to him. He thinks about how he once lamented that the world is narrow, but he now realizes that it is truly vast and strange. Out of nowhere, someone pinches his face while he's looking through the glass. He looks beside him and notices Se-ryung pinching his cheeks as she blankly stares at him. She frowns and asks him how old he is. She reminds him that the years he spent in hibernation don't count, just so he knows. While the captain questions the new guy, Robert and Sunja watch them, considering how odd the entire situation is. They soon reach a building that seems to be built into an asteroid that is in the Pleiades. The Pleiades is a cluster of stars in the Milky Way. The building is the Asteroid Space Tavern, where folks living in space come to have a good time. Inside the tavern, there's an inn called the Wild Crane, with people having drinks and food down below. At one of the tables, Sunja watches in horror as she sees something that surprises her. The new guy just stares squarely at her, wondering what's so big of a deal. The unimaginable sight is now clear as our guy stuffs 6 pieces of hot dogs into his mouth at once, with another mountain of hot dogs still in front of him. Robert whispers to Sunja and asks how a human can eat that much, and Sunja mentions that he has been starving for the past 2,000 years. Robert becomes more worried and asks if he's going to eat 2,000 years worth of food just to quench his hunger, and Sunja tells him that might be the case judging from the way he's eating. Moments after, our guy clears out the plates and stares at the bounty hunters, probably expecting that they make another order. Meanwhile, the keeper of the Wild Crane Inn, Wang the 18th, speaks with Se-ryung and is intrigued by her request. He asks to confirm if she's truly looking for a broker. Se-ryung affirms that she is and says that it must be someone rich and tough, because what she has to sell is extremely expensive and valuable. He jokingly asks her how expensive the thing must be to make the usually laid-back blazing devil so frantic. Se-ryung asks him how much a full collection of 2,000-year-old martial arts manuscripts would be worth if they were all originals and all S-rank. Her words alert Wang, who opens his tiny eyes and stops puffing his cigarette to listen more closely to what she's saying. He continues his puffing and lets out a stream of smoke, considering the question she asked him. Moments later, Wang is seen sitting all by himself after the captain leaves the meeting. One of the nearby guards asks Wang if what she said could really be real. The guard continues by saying that S-rank originals from 2,000 years ago must be incredibly valuable. Wang just continues puffing his cigarette and tells him that the manuscripts are all worth 0 credits. The guard asks again to be sure he heard correctly, since he's certain manuscripts like that could go for a fortune. The innkeeper repeats himself and tells him that the manuscripts are all worth 0 credit. He explains that if such things existed, just one book alone could buy a planet and more. He wonders how a mere mid-tier bounty hunter like the Blazing Devil can claim to have found a bunch of them, which means they must be fakes. He tells the guard to get his head out of the clouds and kick them out. Meanwhile, Se-ryung returns to the table and asks where Sunja has suddenly gone. Robert tells her that she has gone to get some more supplies and asks how her talk with the innkeeper went. Se-ryung's eyes light up and she says their talk was good. She even mentions that Wang promises to contact them immediately he finds someone to buy. Her attention is quickly drawn to something in front of them. In front of them, the new guy relaxes on one of the benches with a dozen empty plates trashed in front of him, as it seems he must have eaten all the food. The captain asks Robert that it's not possible that he ate all that food, and hopes her eyes are deceiving her. Robert just tells her that they're lucky he just stopped eating. The captain puts her hands on her head in regret, and tells Robert that she would have done something else if it wasn't for the money they could make out of this. While she's talking, the tavern's door burst open. The sound draws the attention of everyone in the tavern, who look back to see who their guests are. Some men dressed in matching attire walk into the tavern, and they look like they're trouble. Se-ryung is alerted by their presence, as it seems she recognizes them. She recognizes the serious-looking men as men from a group called the Heavenly Demon Sect. How odd, demon and heaven in the same word. The leader of the squad that came into the tavern starts to scan the surroundings, and it seems like he's looking for someone. He looks at the profiles of the people who are seated in the tavern through a futuristic lens. Meanwhile, Se-ryung affirms that the person scanning the tavern is none other than the leader of the Red Wolf squad of the Heavenly Demon Sect, named Sanjin Wuyue. Robert affirms that and mentions that the Red Wolf platoon are the inspectors of the Demon Sect. He asks why they're here, so Se-ryung tells him that they specialize in tracking, so they must be pursuing someone. She whispers to him not to make eye contact with them so as not to irritate them. Our guy overhears them talking and asks them if they just mentioned a demon sect. Se-ryung turns around to face him, wondering why he's interested in the sect. The new guy, who still has crumbs of hot dogs on his mouth, asks them if they could possibly be referring to the Heavenly Demon Sect, and it seems he recognizes them. The captain asks him how he knows the Heavenly Demon Sect when he's been asleep for thousands of years. She realizes that the Heavenly Demon Sect would have existed in his own timeline too. Our guy stares at her in surprise and asks why the people aren't fleeing in the presence of the Heavenly Demon Sect. He tells them that if they were truly the Demon Sect members, people should be fleeing in panic. Se-ryung asks him why they would flee. She mentions that the Heavenly Demon Sect has its issues, but they still pride themselves on being the foremost orthodox and faith-practicing sect in the universe, because they really are the best. The new guy stares at her in surprise. He wonders how the Demon Sect and the word orthodox can be used in the same sentence. Suddenly, he thinks to himself that his dream, which had always felt empty and distant, seems to have truly come to pass. Meanwhile, Sanjin notices someone odd while he's inspecting the crowd and stops to confirm. A couple sitting near him look back, wondering why he's looking at them. His target isn't the couple, but another man who's quietly sitting alone with his head on his table. Sanjin walks up to him and orders him to look up so he can see his face. When he looks up, the system reads that his internal energy is 52.7 C. It also shows the martial arts he knows and shows that he's wanted on charges of level 2 robbery and assault. Sanjin tells the man that today is his lucky day because he's not the one they're targeting. He orders him to go to the Martial Alliance immediately and go turn himself in, threatening to harm him if he does otherwise. Sanjin stops his sentence midway, and his eyes widen as he feels something odd. A hand seems to have landed on his head, and Sanjin stares blankly, wondering who would have to effrontery to not only be near him, but to put their hands on his head. It turns out to be our martial arts master, who starts to stroke Sanjin's head like a cat. Our guy mentions how admirable he looks, still patting his head like he's a child. The martial artist master tells Sanjin that his seemingly impossible dream seems to have come to pass. Meanwhile, the folks in the tavern freeze and stare at him because they've never seen anyone have the boldness to even come near a member of the demon sect. Some other guys who are playing cards stop playing, realizing that nothing but trouble can come from such an encounter. The martial arts master tells them that they've brought his dream to pass, referring to them as young ones. He starts to fawn over the Heavenly Demon Sect and mentions that it's admirable that they managed to do this. He goes further and hugs Sanjin's head, comforting him for the sufferings they young ones must have endured to achieve such a stature. Even the man that Sanjin was threatening just speechlessly stares at the martial arts master, wondering what the heck is going on. As he continues to hug Sanjin's head, Sanjin doesn't move an inch and asks if the new guy is a child with intelligence issues. Roberts tries to calm Sanjin down and tells him that their friend isn't technically mentally unstable, but he just lacks any social skills whatsoever. Sanjin calls the martial master a child and tells him he should know it's also his lucky day, and tries to remove his hands from around his head. He tells him that if he had sensed just a little bit of martial art from his body, he would have shattered him to pieces. Sazin tries to pull our guy's hands off him but realizes it's harder than he thought and begins to struggle. He's surprised that he can't remove the kid's hand no matter how much energy he's using. Robert wonders why the Red Wolf Gang leader seems to be grunting and asks Seryung if something is wrong, but she tells him she's not sure. Sanjin tries harder to peel off the new guy's hand, using more strength from his martial arts technique, but it doesn't work, so he starts to curse. Sanjin decides to make use of his internal energy drive, so the system activates something called a blood wolf art at the maximum drive rate. Sanjin's eye becomes totally white, and he entered into another mode entirely. He manages to release a great amount of power, and he displaces the new guy, and he shouts at him to stop messing around. The energy he releases is so strong that it encircles the entire inn and knocks away several tables. The onlookers look at him in horror, realizing that it's about to go down. More folks keep watching him to know what's going to happen next. Some of his subordinates watch from behind with their mouths open. The martial arts master quickly returns to his friends and leaves about a meter of space between himself and Sanjin, who is about to bring down the whole building. Sanjin starts to calm down when he sees that his enemy is unscathed, and he realizes the extent of damage he has done to the shop. Seryung tells Robert that it seems the Red Wolf squad leader isn't in good shape recently, and that would explain his inability to remove the new guy's hands. Meanwhile, our guy just stands there and stares blankly at Sanjin. The Red Wolf squad leader starts to scan the new guy, and he asks him who he is. He wonders how it's possible that he is totally unaffected by the release of so much energy when he was planning to kill him instantly. To make things worse, the system scan shows that there is no record of the new guy's internal energy or martial arts, and he finds out he's not in the database at all. Sanjin wonders how a pure natural being can have zero internal energy and still be alive. While he's thinking, our guy interrupts his thinking and tells Sanjin that the Blood Wolf demon art that he just used is one of the lower-level martial arts among the Heavenly Demon's body cultivation art, but he commends that fact the sect has been able to pass it down. He tells the Red Wolf squad leader that the only issue is that his internal energy and chi are not in harmony, because it seems his training method is flawed. Our guy decides to comfort him by telling him today is his lucky day since he gets to meet him to help him personally correct it, which is an opportunity of a lifetime. Sanjin just gets more irritated by his words and calls him a lunatic. He summons a stream of liquid-looking fire and tries to kill the martial arts master on the spot. He summons a fiery hand, which he refers to as the Red Wolf Demon Claw's first form. He quickly strikes our guy with the demon claw, but he simply dodges it by bending backward and doesn't leave where he's standing. Behind the martial master, there's a stream of fire that destroys the inn and causes people to run around in panic. Sanjin continues his rampage and summons another power called the Red Wolf Explosion, but our guy just dodges that one too, with his hands still in his pockets. The Red Wolf squad leader starts to get really exasperated now, and he starts to summon several powers at once. He activates one Red Wolf Tremor Wave and a Red Wolf Ghost Claw at the same time, but the martial art master just dodges it like it's child play. The veins in Sanjin's head start to bulge now as he summons all his strength and intellect to try to take the new guy down. He even transforms one of his hands into a demonic claw and surrounds himself with a whirlwind of demonic fire, hell-bent on killing this dude. In the meantime, our guy keeps watching his display. He gauges that Sanjin has enough internal energy, and his forms are precise, and he keeps on watching each of his moves as he angrily tries to kill him. Eventually, he decides that there seems to be a problem somewhere with the way he's doing it. Sanjin just goes all out, and now his eyes are red, as it seems he's maxing out all the attacks he knows. Our guy soon gets angry and smashes a hand over Sanjin's head, telling him it's enough. The impact of his hand presses the Red Wolf squad's head like a marshmallow, and it seems his brain and skull have been disfigured. As Sanjin breaks the floor with the impact of his fall, our guy tells him his martial arts skills are crude. A large hole develops around where Sanjin hits his head, and it looks like a comet has hit the floor of the inn, cracking the stony floor. The rest of the squad are shocked to see their boss have a mouthful of stone, and they open their mouths at the horrific scene. The onlookers in the tavern are more surprised as they stare wide-eyed, not expecting the odd turn of events. Seryung and Robert are also equally surprised, since this is the first time they would witness members of the prestigious Heavenly Demon sect get it handed to them. Sanjin just remains in the ground, with his head comfortably resting in the space he bulldozed with his impact. Our guy stands in front of him, with his hands still in his pockets. He tells him he learned the skills, but he learned it like a parrot. He explains that true martial arts are not just about imitating skills, but adapting them and making them your own. After he issues the correction, he tells Sanjin to get up and try to hit him again if he understands the correction. Sanjin just remains in the hole, probably in need of brain surgery, and the martial art master angrily tells him to get up. The rest of the Red Wolf squad just stares at him speechlessly, wondering what the heck just happened. They eventually get agitated and ask him where he got the effrontery to attack their platoon leader. They call him a brat and run towards him with the intent to kill. They jump at him with several weapons and martial arts skills activated, but MC just stands there with his hands still in his pocket. Moments later, we end up in the 32nd district of the Heavenly Demon Sect. All the members of the demon sect who had been at the bar are seen injured still inside the tavern, also bearing hand marks that are pressed into their skulls. The commander of the district watches from a screen in disbelief, and it seems he can't believe his eyes. Meanwhile, a robot scans Sanjin, who seems to be unconscious, and tries to open his eyelids to confirm if he's still alive. He seems to be bleeding from his nose and mouth and missing a few teeth. Sanjin and the rest of the crew are loaded up on stretchers, while other members of the Heavenly Demon Sect put a do not cross line around them to stop the onlookers from crossing the crime scene. The commander, Zhang Ritak, continues to watch the whole conundrum, and he remarks that this is unbelievable. A senior elder of the district, Joe Chunrock, tells him that it's fortunate that they only suffered severe bruising and their lives are not in danger. Zhang wonders what he means by fortunately, when all he sees are badly beaten men that look like they'll need surgeries. He mentions that the worst part is that they were beaten by a mere unknown stranger as he looks at the new guy's picture. He looks pretty innocent in the shot, but little do they know that he's carrying 2,000 years worth of knowledge and power. Zhang asks Joe again if their sect's Red Wolf platoon was really put in such a state by a mere stranger. He asks him if this unknown stranger is truly not registered in the Martial Alliance database, and Joe tells him he's not, but his companions were registered. Joe explains that they are a group of bounty hunters known as the S-Devil. He says they mainly clean up B-class or lower petty criminals. He tells Zhang that their leader is a person named Seryung the Blazing Devil. Meanwhile, in the S-Devil aircraft, the new guy humbly sits at the table with a napkin around his neck and a knife and fork, expecting food. He sits across the table from Seryung and Robert, who just watch him and try to figure out what to say or ask. At the Heavenly Demon District, Zhang asks to know more about Seryung the Blazing Devil. Joe tells him that she's a quite well-known bounty hunter that goes between orthodox and unorthodox worlds. He tells him that they left the Wild Crane Inn after the incident, but he says they can track them. He asks the commander if they should send a team to pursue them. Commander Yang tells him not to bother and tells him he'll handle the matter personally. Joe just stares at him blankly, wondering what he means by that. He bows out and proceeds to leave the commander to think of his next course of action. The commander presses a nearby button and decides to place a call to an ally. The system starts to initiate a call with someone on the large screen after the button is pressed. The commander patiently waits for the call to go through. Soon enough, a priestly-looking man named Kim Sungbom, the leader of a group called the Greenwood Group, appears on the screen and smiles at him. Kim tells him it's been a while and greets him. He asks the commander if there's a request he has. Zhang frowns but doesn't say anything for a while. Meanwhile, Seryung watches the stars through the window of the aircraft and tries to clear her head. In the 32nd Heavenly Demon District, the commander seems to have finished relaying the message to Kim, who asks if he'd like the Greenwood Group to handle the issue. Somewhere else in space, the S-Devil aircraft blazes through space. Inside, our guy starts to get tired of waiting for food that doesn't seem to be coming. In front of him, Seryung and Roberts just watch him, still not saying a word. They continue to watch him wait for Sunja to finish grilling the hot dogs, and they still don't say a word. Robert whispers to the captain and asks her if she's honestly as scared as he is right now. Seryung looks at him with an irritated expression and asks him what he's talking about. He reminds her that she also saw it with her own eyes too. He reminds her that Sanjin Wei and the Red Wolf platoon are all A-rank martial artists, and he had just slapped them down with a single blow of his hands. Apparently, a single blow of his hand hit all of Sanjin's subordinates and sent them flying back, with teeth flying out left and right. Roberts recalls seeing them flying away like bugs and remembers one guy who smashes into a pillar. Seryung just looks at him and doesn't say anything. She later says that she could have taken those guys too if she fought them seriously, since they're the lowest level of their rank, even though they're A rank. Robert just confesses that he, on the other hand, would only have been able to scratch them just a bit if he had put his life on the line. He reminds her that the martial arts master just swatted them aside like flies, and he didn't seem to struggle with it at all. Seryung gets tired of listening to him and walks toward our guy. She bangs her hands on the table, and he just looks at her expressionlessly, wondering what the problem is now. She softly tells him that they need to talk. He just keeps staring at her, and he doesn't say a word. He soon breaks the silence and tells her he'll have to eat first before they can talk. Seryung sits in front of him with her arms crossed and insists that they talk first. She rudely speaks to him and asks him what his name is. Robert quickly interjects and suggests that she used honorifics to refer to him, but she just asks him if he's deaf and asks him what his name is again. Sunja soon arrives with a wide dish of freshly grilled hot dogs, and this catches our guy's attention. The captain tells him not to even think about eating until they're done talking, and she demands that he tell her his name. He just glares at her, but he doesn't say a word. Robert tries to resolve the conflict and whispers to the captain that it's popularly said that it's not right to bother a dog when it's eating, so he suggests that they let him eat first, but the captain doesn't seem to be buying it. He tells them his name is Lee Mokjin. Seryung asks him about his identity and past profession to understand how he was able to do all he did. He just stares at her blankly and doesn't say a word, still holding on to his cutlery. She continues to stare at him, expecting a response, and it seems they've started a staring competition. He finally breaks the ice and tells her he's a heavenly demon. Not just a heavenly demon, but he's a supreme heavenly demon. Seryung repeats what he just said and wonders if he truly just referred to himself as a supreme heavenly demon. She wonders what nonsense Lee is saying and asks if they fed him bad hot dogs that's making him hear things. Suddenly, the aircraft's alarm starts to blare out and the warning lights come on. Everyone becomes alert and they wonder what's happening. Nearby, another aircraft announces that its target has been detected. Sunja quickly goes to the system and explains that someone who's close to them is targeting them. Seryung rises up to check it out, and she says she knew the heavenly demon would be coming after them and wouldn't leave them alone after Lee beat up the Red Wolf platoon. She exclaims in frustration, realizing they're in big trouble. Sunja continues monitoring things on the system and tells her it's not the heavenly demon sect. A giant ship with a skull painted across its body appears, and Sunja tells them the group targeting them is Greenwood. Meanwhile, outside the ship, several aircraft that belong to the Greenwood group are seen surrounding the S-Devil aircraft. From inside one of the ships, Kim is told that the S-Devil ship has been confirmed and they're the targets they were paid bounty to deal with. Kim, the leader of the Galaxy Division of the 72 Strongholds of Greenwood, also known as the Black Tiger of the Crescent Moon, just watches and doesn't say a word. The Greenwood military captain asks Kim if they should go ahead to fire the EMP capture round. Kim asks the captain if it's confirmed that these guys are bounty hunters. The captain tells him that they are, and they found out that they mainly operate in the outskirts of the galaxy, and their leader is someone called Blazing Devil Seryung. The Black Tiger thinks to himself and wonders why the Heavenly Demon sect would bother with a small-time sect like this, and it seems something is fishy. He recalls the conversation he had with Yang, where he had offered him the job to deal with this problem. He remembers cheerfully accepting the bounty, asking Yang for the completion conditions, and asking what they should do once they capture the target. Unlike what he expected, Yang tells him not to capture them but to just erase them from existence. Kim's eyes widen in horror, and he clarifies by asking if he wants them to kill the targets. In the present time, the Black Tiger mentions that this situation seems odd, and he suspects that something is going on. He mentions that the Heavenly Demon sect are far better at taking lives than they are, and he believes that there must be a reason they had specifically entrusted them with the task. The captain just listens to his deduction and becomes equally surprised. Kim hesitates for a while and considers what to do next. He says that there must be a trap that has been set for them inside the S-Devil ship. Inside the S-Devil ship, Seryung peers out the window and sees the fleet of ships surrounding them. She mentions that the Greenwood group are bandits and must be here to rob them, but Robert tells her he doubts that. He explains that there's no reason for the group to bring such a large fleet just to rob extremely poor folks like them, since there's little profit they can make. Seryung winces at him for calling them extremely poor folks, and tells him she gets it, but it's odd when he puts it like that. She tells him it doesn't matter anyway, and calls the Greenwood group scumbag robbers. She threatens to beat them and toss them out if they get in their way. Robert just looks at her making big-mouthed claims, while Lee watches the beautiful fleets of ships surrounding them. Sunja finally speaks some sense into her and tells her it's not that simple, since they are just a part of the Galaxy Division of the 72 Strongholds of Greenwood, and it appears that they had mobilized an entire division to come capture them. Seryung is surprised to hear that the whole division was mobilized, and she asks if that means that their leader, Kim, is here too. Meanwhile, Lee keeps watching the Greenwood ships scan them, and he exclaims about how cool it looks. Seryung thinks about the Black Tiger Kim Sungbom and says that even she cannot beat that guy easily. Robert tells her she can't beat him at all because she'd be dead in 3 moves if she stood against him. Seryung becomes annoyed and tells him it's not that bad, and she says she may be able to do something if she really puts her mind to it. Robert doesn't let her finish her sentence and tells her to forget it, and suggests that they surrender quickly, and tells her not to panic since they have nothing to lose. The captain just frowns since he had just burst her bubbles. She soon rises to the occasion and commands everyone to follow her command from now on. She explains that they'll first fire the EMP capture round to cut off the ship's energy and incapacitate them, which she'll permit. She says that they'll board the ship armed, and she'll permit that too. Lastly, she says they'll allow them to search the ship, and they'll also donate any unnecessary items to them for survival if they want them. Robert just asks her how that is any different from surrendering, but she shouts at him to comply as instructed. She goes to Pat Lee, who is still stargazing, and tells him not to panic when the EMP hits because the ship will shake a little bit. Se-ryung tells him that the EMP has no destructive power because they're not allowed to use ship weapons because of the space laws. She gloats that it seems Lee didn't understand that, but just tells him not to interfere since they'll leave when they take whatever they want. She mentions that the only time she won't be able to guarantee anything is if a fight breaks out and things escalate. Se-ryung asks Sunja if she's locked on and asks her to brace for the impact of the EMP round. Sunja suddenly exclaims and tells them it's not an EMP round but a photon cannon, and the system starts to give a danger alert. Now this shocks Se-ryung, who just turns around in surprise. Sunja tells her that they're using a ship-destroying photon cannon, which means they're trying to kill them. Se-ryung goes on high alert and says that this is crazy. Meanwhile, on the Greenwood ship, the captain tells Kim that what they're doing violates space regulations, and it may cause them trouble later on. He suggests that it would be better for them to capture the target and quietly dispose of them. The division leader tells him they can't do that because he has a bad feeling. He tells them to just blow the ship to dust and complicate matters since they can just shift all the responsibility to the client, who is the Heavenly Demon Sect. Kim orders that the cannons be fired when ready. Meanwhile, tension increases inside the S-Devil ship. Se-ryung asks Sunja if they can warp the ship to another location, but Sunja tells her they can't because they are surrounded on all sides. Se-ryung asks if they can use the shields, but Sunja tells her they won't work since they've sold some of the ship's parts to cater for their living expenses. A look of horror develops on the captain's face as she becomes confused about what to do. A few moments ago, she had it all figured out. Now, they're about to be blown to bits. In the Greenwood ship, the captain tells the division leader that the photon cannon has been fully charged. Kim orders that they fire the photon cannon. The cannon is activated, and they fire at the S-Devil bounty hunters, who are just waiting to be wiped out of existence. Se-ryung Sunja and just watches their death arrives. Robert screams at the top of his lungs and Lee just watches, still looking clueless about all that's going on. An explosion occurs after the photon cannot hit the target, and it seems that the end of our beloved bounty hunters. Kim watches from his ship as the explosion rips through the space around them. The explosion is so bright that the light from it reaches the ship he's in. Suddenly his eyes widen when something strange catches his attention. After the fire from the explosion goes out, the S-Devil ship looks to be completely intact and unscathed. The ship flies despite the onslaught of dangerous fire, and it looks like the attack didn't hit them at all. In front of the S-Devil ship, a larger round ship appears, who seems to have taken the impact of the photon cannon. The larger ship moved in front of the S-Devil ship just in time to block the attack, and it completely shielded it from the Greenwoods. A woman wearing white armor and holding a white spear appears on top of the new ship. Se-ryung, who had been holding on to Sunja for dear life, asks what that is. A look of horror develops on Kim's face as he recognizes the woman as the 8-foot fighting ghost, Elena. Elena just stands there with her spear behind her and stares right at the Greenwood fleet. Inside the S-Devil ship, Lee stares outside, shocked to see all that's going on. By his side, Robert and Se-ryung are glued to the window, also curious to know how they're still alive. Meanwhile, Elna still turns her back to them and faces the Greenwood fleet, looking to deflect any more attacks from them. It's one woman and her ship against about a dozen ships, but no one seems to be doing anything to attack her. Kim becomes strained, and he wonders why Elena showed up here. Elena just looks right at him and waits for him to make his next move. Inside the Greenwood ship, the captain tells Kim that Elena is using a terraformation-grade shield, and they can penetrate it if they max out the photon cannot output, and asks if they should recharge. Kim tells him there's no need to start a space war just to deal with a cockroach. He tells him that their adversary isn't a person so easily to handle, so he orders that they set up the teleportation so he can go speak with her. As they prepare the teleportation device, he wonders why this monster suddenly showed up here. Meanwhile, Robert tells the other that the 8-foot fighting ghost Elena is a S-class bounty hunter who's so unpredictable that even the leaders of most sects avoid her. He wonders why she's here, and Se-ryung agrees that she doesn't know, but it seems she saved their lives. She mentions that if Elena hadn't blocked the photon cannon, they'd be atomized by now. Soon after, Kim teleports to Elena's ship to have a civilized discussion with her. He calls her sister Elena and tells her it's been a while since they've seen each other, but Elena doesn't even say a word. She blankly looks at him and keeps quiet, probably wondering where they've met before. Kim continues by asking if she hasn't forgotten him. He decides to introduce himself as her 55th younger brother and reminds her that he greeted her at their mother's birthday 2 years ago. But Elena tells him to get lost. Her words sting Kim, who is just trying to have a conversation, but he decides not to overreact. He formally introduces him as the leader of the Galaxy Division of the 72 Strongholds of Greenwood, and not as her brother, to make things clear that he's not here to play. Kim tells her that telling him to get lost is the same as telling all of Greenwood to get lost, and he cannot accept that. Elena just keeps staring at him and activates her martial art, preparing for a fight. Robert takes notice of this, and he mentions that it looks like they're about to fight. Se-ryung mentions that it's not going to be easy even for Greenwood because Elena isn't easily touched. She adds that dealing with Elena alone is tough, but it could easily become worse if her mother lioness jumps out from behind too. Robert continues to watch Elena closely and asks what Se-ryung means by mother lioness. When Kim realizes things are about to go awry, he jokes that Elena is the same as ever, resorting to fists to have a conversation. He raises up his hands and tells her he surrenders, trying to avoid trouble. He tells her to relax because he doesn't want to fight, but Elena still continues in her martial form. Kim thinks to himself that a fight is a great loss, especially for a crap job like this. He suggests that they resolve it peacefully and says he would like to know the reason for her intervention. The Black Tiger asks Elena if the S-Devil bounty hunters are her targets and says they will yield if it overlaps with theirs. Elena just turns around and walks toward the S-Devil ship, telling Kim to get lost one more time. Kim frowns, realizing it's pointless to try to reason with Elena. He continues to wonder why she suddenly showed up for such useless things. Meanwhile, the S-Devil bounty hunters continue to eagerly watch the entire show from their window. Elena walks towards them and connects to their comms. She tells them to hand what they have over, or die. Her words resound through the ship's speaker, and those on the ship hear her. Se-ryung looks puzzled and wonders what's going on now. Robert starts to freak out and wonders why Elena wants to rob them too, since they don't have anything valuable. He asks the captain if she stashed something valuable in the ship without telling them, and even answers himself due to his panic. He repeats that there's nothing here that could attract an S-rank bounty hunter, and it seems Lee figures out something because his eyes widen. Robert and Se-ryung immediately turn their attention to Lee because he's the only thing that Elena could be worth anything to Elena. Lee just keeps watching the whole thing through the window. Se-ryung asks him if he knows Elena, and questions whether he had a fling with her in the past, and they had a bad breakup before he ran away. Lee tells them Elena is not here because of him. Se-ryung becomes confused and asks what he means. He turns back and tells them Elena is probably here because of the child behind them. When they turn around, there's no one there, which confuses them. The captain asks him what he means, since there's no one standing there. Lee tells the child to show herself and tells her there's nothing to fear. For a minute nothing happens, and the space remains empty. Suddenly, a young girl starts to materialize out of thin air and her head appears first. Her appearance shocks the bounty hunters, who turn around to take a good look at her. Shortly after, she completely materializes in the ship. Se-ryung is surprised to see the random girl, and Robert is completely freaked out. The girl just looks at them and doesn't say a word. Se-ryung becomes alerted and grabs Lee, asking him what's with the little girl and where she came from. Lee tells them that she followed them from the inn. He says she had presence but no form, so he let her be. He says she did a great job to conceal her breathing too, which is such an advanced stealth technique, and it seems martial arts has developed in the current timeline. The girl just remains silent and doesn't say a word to any of them. Sunja tells him that the girl isn't using a stealth technique but is wearing a stealth ring, which allowed her to cloak herself. Sunja mentions that the stealth ring is quantum technology and is really expensive stuff. The captain says she doesn't care if it's expensive or not and walks up to the girl, demanding to know who she is and what her intentions are. Se-ryung towers over her while the girl looks up at her, and she demands to know why she snuck into their ship. The young girl introduces herself as Yong Hwa Rin and looks quite scared. The captain interjects that she didn't ask for her name and demands to know if the people outside are after her and if she's their target. Hwa Rin, who is almost in tears, tells her that they're probably after her. Meanwhile, Elena just stands outside and waits for their response. Hwa Rin tells them that as long as she's alive, they won't stop coming for her. Robert suddenly loses his mind when he realizes that the girl said her name is Hwa Rin, which surprises the captain. Still looking surprised, she asks him if he knows the girl. He starts to act like little fangirl and says it's impossible that he wouldn't recognize her since she's the main vocalist of a band called the Pronosian. Se-ryung looks at him in surprise and asks him who the Pronosians are since she's never heard of them. It turns out they're not as popular as Robert thought. He exclaims that the Pronosians are the galaxy's top rookie idol duo, and he tries to remind her of a song called Dynamite Doo-Doo-Doo. The song sounds so weird that it's obvious why the Se-ryung wouldn't know it. Robert explains that she's the main vocalist of the idol group that sang the hit song. He reminds the captain that he plays the song every time and she always dances to it. He quickly does a Google search on her to confirm, and he sees that the girl is truly his idol, and he comments that she's even prettier in person. I wonder if there are space laws against child abuse because Robert needs to be locked up. He checks out a beautiful picture of Hua Rin on his phone and says she's from a place called Mount Hua, which is where he's from. He starts to list out her profile like a creep and says that she's 162 cm, 47.4 kilon, has blood type AB, EFSP, and she's allergic to cats. Elena becomes impatient, and she tells them through the comms that this is their last warning, and they have 10 minutes to hand over what's with them. Elena repeats to them that they can either hand her over or she'll kill them all. Her voice gets everyone's attention, and they stop all they're doing and remember they're literally at gunpoint. Robert asks Miss Hua Rin, as he calls her, why all these people are after her, and it looks like he's going to cry because they're about to take his idol away. Seryung just keeps quiet as she realizes the uncomfortable decision they have to make. She tells Robert it doesn't matter since they're going to have to surrender the girl regardless. Seryung tells the girl that, to be clear, she's an uninvited guest who has nothing to do with them since she snuck into their ship. The captain hesitantly tells her that she needs to leave to avoid causing them any trouble. Roberts exclaims at what the captain said, obviously not cool with the idea of giving the girl away. Seryung turns her back to him and insists that she's made her decision as the captain of the ship. Hua Rin just stares at her silently, realizing she's about to be given over to her captors. When they lock Hua Rin in the release chute, Robert mentions to the captain that he doesn't think what they're doing is right, especially because the girl is the main vocalist of Pronosian. Seryung tells him they can't protect her because they can barely handle Greenwood, not to mention fighting against the 8-foot demon Elena. She tells him that even if they hold their ground, the fate of the girl wouldn't change at all, but their own fates will because they'll all die. Seryung reluctantly but firmly hits the red button to open the ship's door. She confesses to Robert that she's in pain too concerning the decision, but nothing can be done. Hua Rin just stands there waiting for her fate, while the system announces that the door lock has been disengaged and it proceeds to open the gate. Hua Rin just stands there trying to brace up against what happens next. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a hand lands on her shoulder. She is surprised and looks to her right to see Lee standing next to her, and he has the weirdest look on his face as he usually does when he sees crazy things. He looks over at her and reminds her that he had told her not to be worried. She just looks at him in shock, surprised that he'd follow her out when they're up against a monster. Seryung looks through glass and sees Lee with Hua Rin, and she loses her mind, wondering how and when he got in there. Robert is equally surprised to see that Lee had gone in with her. Seryung quickly hurries to close the gate, wondering how crazy Lee could be. Robert tells her they should wait to see what happens since Lee is pretty strong and may even defeat Elena. Seryung asks him if he's crazy and reminds him that it's space out there, and Lee doesn't have a space shield on and won't be able to breathe. As the gates open, tensions rise as Lee follows the girl out, and it looks like he's about to get himself killed by space even before Elena gets to him. The captain orders Sunja to quickly close the gate. Sunja looks surprised but tells her it's too late to close the gate. Seryung is shocked to hear that it's too late to do that, so she goes to look through the window. Through the window, she notices Lee and Hua Rin have stepped out of the ship and have gone into space. A look of horror develops on Seryung's face as she thinks about how much of an insane nutcase Lee is. As she looks through the window, she remains surprised that he actually went out. Meanwhile, Lee and Hua Rin float right outside the ship and head towards Elena's ship. Hua Rin tightens her grip and tries to brace for what happens next when they get to Elena's ship, and Lee still keeps a hand on her shoulder. She looks back at Lee and thanks him for following her. She tells him their opponents are really strong martial artists, and he needs to be careful. When she turns around, she is surprised to see Lee's bloodshot eyes and expressionless gaze, which means he's unable to breathe. He starts to choke as he tries to contain the little oxygen he has left, and Hua Rin just stares at him. She becomes alarmed and wonders what's wrong with him. She asks him why he's like that and tells him not to tell her he doesn't have a shield. Lee starts to cough, and he starts to throw his arms around, trying to get back to the ship, but it doesn't work. Hua Rin watches him in surprise as she realizes he really doesn't have a shield, and it looks like her savior is about to die. Lee keeps struggling to go back to the ship, but it doesn't work, and Hua Rin just stands there unsure of what to do to help him. Meanwhile, Elena watches the both of them from her ship. Kim and Elena watch in shock, wondering what's going on. Someone suddenly screams out at Lee that it's 300 degrees outside and the pressure would burst his internal organs within 10 seconds, asking why he would go out there without a shield in the first place. It's clear that our guy knows nothing about the rules of space. Lee continues to cough, and his face becomes purple as he waves his hands frantically, trying to get back to the ship. He becomes really purple and swollen and continues to choke. His eyes become red and swollen, and they look like they're about to pop out of their socket. His eyelids suddenly start to close, and it looks like he's fallen unconscious after losing all his oxygen. Suddenly, whoever was talking to him before places their hands around his purple face. It turns out to be Seryung, who had come out of the ship to try to save his life. She places a nano shield on his face and activates it to allow him breathe in space. When he doesn't move, she keeps screaming at him to wake up and breathe. When he still doesn't respond, she becomes scared and asks him what he's doing and why he's not responding. Suddenly, Lee opens his eyes and stares right at her. She lets go of him and breathes a sigh of relief that he's alive. She tells him she thought he was dead and jokingly calls him a bastard. He tells her she's worried for no reason since he's the supreme being of heaven and earth, and there's nothing in this world that can threaten his life. Se-ryung just stares at him, shocked. That was not the thank you she was expecting. Lee looks back at Elena's ship and notices that Hua Rin, who was trying to save, had reached the ship and is walking towards Elena. He asks Se-ryung how he can get to the ship. Inside the ship, Robert also breathes a sigh of relief when he sees that Lee is alive, and he's happy that Se-ryung wasn't too late. Sunja starkly tells him that she was actually very late, and even the greatest master can't withstand space without a shield for less than a minute. She tells him that Lee endured all that for 6 minutes and 13 seconds, and the odd part is that all his organs are still normal. Meanwhile, Se-ryung helps Lee reach the ship, and Hua Rin is surprised to see him behind her. Sunja tells Robert that Lee has by far surpassed every human limit. On the ship, Elena waits for Hua Rin and other accomplices to walk towards her, with Kim still standing behind her even though she told him to get lost. Lee stands in front of them, with Hua Rin a little bit behind him and Se-ryung farther back. Elena just stares at them blankly and doesn't say a word. Se-ryung watches Elena closely and notices that the 8-foot fighting demon's aura is no joke, and it suits her reputation as a fighting maniac. She also notices Kim standing behind Elena and realizes it's even worse for them that Kim from Greenwood is also here. She tells Lee not to cause trouble and walks toward Elena. She tells him she'll handle it and orders that he doesn't intervene. She cooks up the best smile she can and waves at Elena. She tells her it's nice to see her and asks her if she's as healthy as ever. That's so cringe. She continues to babble that she's heard a lot about them and says seeing them in person is even better. She introduces herself as Se-ryung, the leader of the S-Devils, also known as the Blazing Devils. Elena just stares at her blankly, and it's clear she's never heard of her. Greenwood does the same and doesn't say a word. Meanwhile, Hua Rin grabs a hold of Lee's hand out of fear. He notices her hands touch him, so he looks at her over his shoulder. Hua Rin obviously looks petrified, and it looks like she's holding her breath. He tells her that there's no need to be nervous and reminds her that he's here with her. Hua Rin tells him that Elena is not human, obviously petrified at what she can do to her. She continues that Elena is a fighting ghost who has been traveling around the world ever since she was young to look for worthy opponents. Apparently, no one has survived meeting her so far. So much so that she even built a spaceship as a fighting arena just to travel and fight. Lee is impressed by her qualifications and calls Elena a remarkable child. He says she's a young one who is dedicating her heart and soul to martial training, which makes her a rare talent indeed. Hua Rin tells him that's not really what she meant, trying to make it clear that Elena is dangerous. Meanwhile, Se-ryung still continues her cheerful introduction and tells them that whatever the case may be, as fellow Central Plain people, they should talk peacefully. Suddenly, Elena sends a deadly power wave towards her and tells her that she talks with her sword. The impact is so strong that the wave sweeps past Se-ryung's location up until the end of the ship and causes a big explosion. Elena seems to have waved her spear at Se-ryung to eliminate her from the way, since she has no time for cheap talk. Her eyes shine with a bright blue as she waits for the smoke to clear out and find Se-ryung's dead body. She maintains her stand, still waiting for the smoke from the large explosion to clear out. The smoke doesn't clear out for a minute because the move wasn't a threat, but was supposed to kill everyone it crosses. Suddenly, Se-ryung lands back on the ground, as it seems she was quick and smart enough to avoid standing in the way of the energy wave. Se-ryung asks her what she's doing when she had just proposed that they talk. She asks her why she's just swinging her weapon out nowhere. Kim watches the whole thing from behind and thinks to himself that Se-ryung isn't that bad, because even though the attack wasn't full power, it wasn't still an attack easy to dodge. Se-ryung just glares at her, waiting for a response to her question. Elena asks what her name is again, and tells her it would have been better for her not to dodge at all. The 8-foot fighting demon starts to transform and activate her martial arts skill. Kim reasons that Se-ryung should know that her opponent is a mad scorpion that gets more poisonous the more you provoke it, which means she'll just die more painfully. Suddenly, they all hear the sound of a hiccup from inside the smoke that's still behind them, which surprises Se-ryung. The hiccup sound continues, and Kim looks closely to know where it's coming from. It turns out to be Hua Rin, who can't handle all the smoke, so Lee tries to pat her in the back to make her better. He tells her she's getting scared over trivial matters and tells her Elena's attacks are just childish pranks. Meanwhile, Kim is shocked by what he's seeing and wonders how that's possible. Lee keeps patting Hua Rin's back, and he tells her the attack may be grand, but it's just a noisy firecracker. He tells her not to get frightened by an empty tin can. Kim considers that Lee must have been standing in the way of the attack judging by his position, and wonders how he's perfectly fine. While Elena is increasing her strength, Lee just helps Hua Rin regulate her breathing and completely ignores the fight going on in front of him. Elena stares at them and continues to increase her internal energy level. She suddenly reaches a higher level, and streaks of bright pink lighting emanate from her body. Our hero still ignores her and tries to help Hua Rin stop her hiccup. Elena just gets confused at why he's ignoring her and stares at him blankly. When Hua Rin calms down, Lee steps forward and addresses Elena as a child. Seryung gets angry that he interrupted her and reminds him that she told him not to get involved. Lee just continues and asks Elena what business she has here. He tells her to speak to him if he has any business with the child, referring to Hua Rin. Kim tries to scan him but realizes he's unidentified and there's no data on him. He also notices his has no internal energy drive equipped. While she scans him, Lee tells Elena that Hua Rin is under his protection, so any business with her goes through him. The Black Tiger is surprised to learn that he has no identification and internal drive and wonders if he's a nameless natural from the outskirts. Lee continues by telling Elena that if she has no business here, she can leave, and he just waves his hands at her to explain his point. While he speaks, a bright light suddenly pops up as Elena responds. Something as bright as a star suddenly appears on their radar. The light is so bright that it catches the attention of Seryung, Kim, and Hua Rin. The light appears on the ship and appears to summon a streak of blue lightning to the top of the ship. It looks like some major power demonstration. Meanwhile, Lee uses his hand to stop Elena's bright spear, which seems to have been used to summon the lightning and bright light for an attack. He stops the spear with his bare hands, and it doesn't seem to harm him at all. Elena is seen holding the spear, and it seems she had launched a frontal attack as a response to him asking her to leave. Meanwhile, our guy stops the spear with one hand while the other is in his pocket. Lee is surprised that she attacked him and asks her if her interest here is to fight with him. Kim's eyes almost pop out of his socket as he can't believe his eyes. He wonders how a person can deflect the fighting ghost Elena's strike with just a palm, especially since he doesn't have any internal energy. Meanwhile, Lee starts to analyze Elena's martial arts skills like he always does. He tells her something is odd about utilizing the radiant sword technique of Dayankang sect with a staff and channeling the Shaolin's great Brahma divine art for internal energy. He stares at her expressionlessly and asks how she already has internal energy surpassing 3 cycles when she's so young. He wonders if she had a fortunate encounter. By the way, cycles is what often shows up in Muram martial arts stories where they count their internal energy strength with 60-year cycles. That means that 1 cycle is equal to 60 years worth of energy. While he's talking, Elena starts to increase the rate her internal energy drive is working to 90%, and more lightning starts to come out of her body. Lee stares at her in shock, surprised that she was able to attain 3 cycles, and she's now able to switch her internal energy to Wudang's red sun art. He finally takes his hands out of his pocket and keeps watching her max out her internal energy drive. Right now, she's operating her drive at 95%. Meanwhile, Kim just stares at her and wonders if Elena was always this strong or if something has changed. Lee just looks at her silently, wondering how far she plans to go with this. He asks her if her plan is to go all out and starts to activate his own martial energy as his hands start to burn bright. Suddenly, the ring on Elena's hand starts to shine and tingle. She maintains her attack stance as she continues to increase her energy usage, and the rings continue to shine. Suddenly, the ring lets out a warning sound, which shocks Elena because that's a bad thing. We flash back to a time when Elena is speaking to her mother. Her mother tells her she won't stop her from leaving for the world to chase her dreams. Elena kneels before her mother while she addresses her. Her mother tells her that she'll permit any fight that furthers her training, but she's not allowed to get herself killed. Elena continues to listen while remaining in a submissive position as her mother addresses her. Her mother tells her that she is already strong, and there are less than 10 martial artists that can hurt her throughout all the word, and even they cannot push her to the brink of death. She reaches out for Elena, who bows submissively to her. Her mother reminds her to always remember that she is her mother. She puts a ring on her finger and tells her there is one rule she has to keep if she wants to leave the home. She tells her that if the ring sounds at any time, she must flee no matter what. The sound of the ring means that the opponent is beyond her reach. Her mother tells her that if she ignores the warning, she'll surely die. Back in the present time, the fighting demon collapses in shock when she realizes the consequence of the ring's sound. She stares at Lee, who just seems to be a weak young boy. Elena decides not to back down and continues to fight when she recalls some hurtful people who have put her down with hurtful words when she was much younger. She remembers some of her mother's children asking her what she's hesitating for and telling her to run with her tail between her legs. She recalls them telling her to know her place and asking her what she can do. She hears voices reminding her to hide away and live. She remembers when she was a little kid in the midst of the many children her mother has, who taunted her. She remembers her mother telling her to greet them because they are her siblings. Her mother tells her that they have different fathers, but they are all born from her womb. She recalls standing alone and her mother telling her that they all need to stay close to each other since they share her blood. She remembers some of her mother's kids asking what her name was again. In the present day, Elena decides to stand her ground and fight to the end. She starts to increase her energy drive from 98% to 100% to 110%, and even as far as 120%, which shouldn't be possible. The 8-foot fighting demon generates a great deal of energy, and the entire ship is almost set ablaze by all the power. Lee just frowns as he looks at her, and he seems a bit more alarmed by how far she's going. Se-ryung also watches in surprise, and so does Kim. Our guy waits for her to do her thing, and watches her complete her transformation. Her suit morphs into something new, and it seems she's a totally different being. She looks like some sort of panther, and her hands look unnatural, which means she has morphed into a high-level killing beast. Lee mutters to himself that she had just used a skill that he's never heard of, because he has never seen someone perform a transformation with the Transcendental Awakening skill. He tells himself that it seems martial arts have evolved so much as time has passed. While he's thinking, Elena leaps off the ground and launches towards him. Meanwhile, Lee feels that martial arts have advanced a little bit too much. He doesn't make any move, and just stands here with his hands in his pocket, even up until Elena gets right in his face and starts to swing her weapon. As she swings at him, he dodges it quickly and mentions that the move is the chaotic storm sword technique of the Ime sect. She makes another move that looks like a spiral of fire, and he still continues to dodge. He identifies the move as the sun and moon twin wheels of the Kunlun sect. The 8-foot fighting demon starts to get angry and increases her energy level to 125%. She lands several attacks at once, which our guy still dodges and identifies as the sun-piercing spear technique and the falling sunblade technique of the Diankang sect. Elena decides to amp things up a bit and goes to 140%. She creates a swirling fire tornado attack, but Lee just bends backwards and easily dodges that too, recognizing it as the dog-beating stick technique and the drunken 8 immortal steps of the beggar's sect. While still crouched, Lee frowns as he wonders how she's also able to add the 4,000 red needles of the esoteric sect. Elena is on fire today, so she goes up to 170% since she never loses a fight. She now comes at him with 2 iron claws and explosive energy in her hands, and our guy just jumps backward to dodge her attacks because he's on the defensive. He shouts at her that it's enough already and waves his hand in front of him. The weight of his attack lets out a stream of fire that goes right towards Elena, who was jumping towards him. The attack is so strong that a massive explosion that covers the entire area of the ship is triggered, and it looks like everybody's going to die from this one. The weight of the smoke is so heavy this time, and Lee just stands to see what happened to Elena. Suddenly, something comes out of the smoke that catches his eye. Even Kim is freaked out by what they see, and it looks like he's not seen something this freaky in all his years at the job. Hwarin and Se-ryung equally watch in astonishment. It turns out to be Elena, who now has about 8 arms, each wielding a weapon. She's gone freaky with this stuff, all right. She looks like one of those Indian gods and just levitates right in the air, armed with 8 bright swords. Suddenly, she rushes toward Lee, hoping to cut him in all ways possible. Now, she's at 190%, and it seems she's not going to stop. She launches an overhead attack at him and comes down in a blaze of fire, but he just stands there and stares at her. She rushes towards him in fierce determination, and the metallic armor seems to have covered up her entire body, making her almost unhuman. Lee just looks up and frowns at how far she's taking this, hoping she'd just stop. Elena does the opposite of that and continues to move towards him at full speed. He thinks to himself that her talent is admirable, but she's crossed the line of righteousness. As she continues to rush towards him, Lee reasons that her awakening exposes wounds and desires, which means she's just being consumed by herself. He keeps watching her come towards him and believes that she's carrying many inner demons. Suddenly, Lee generates an explosive power in his hand and thinks to himself that if she goes any further, he'd have no choice but to kill her to stop her. Meanwhile, Hwarin stands behind him and watches Elena come towards them. Out of our guy's hands, a strange celestial sword emerges, and he tells himself that he promised to protect Hwarin. Se-ryung and Kim are shocked when they realize that Lee is wielding something known as a heart sword. The 8-foot fighting demon doesn't stop and ignores the sword in his hands, hell-bent on sending him to his grave. It looks like only one person will live to tell this tale. When she almost reaches where he is, he angrily strikes her with the sword and tells her to stop. The energy released is so massive that it almost blinds those who are watching the fight, and even Robert struggles to see due to the brightness of the light. An explosion is seen over Elena's ship from Robert's point of view. The explosion from the impact of the heart sword is so powerful that it splits the entire ship into several pieces. The entire ship suddenly explodes in space in the presence of the Greenwood fleet. The explosion of the ship is so great that it looks like a bright star from afar. From the main Greenwood ship, the captain watches in horror as he sees the explosion from where his boss is. The explosion is so strong that there was no way that Kim could have survived it. Suddenly he hears a cough close by. It turns out that Kim had teleported back just in time before the ship exploded. Kim screams out Lord Cheju's name, and he looks quite bloody and battered. He tells the captain that he's not dead, and Cheju tries to help him stand properly. Kim rests on a wall and looks through the window to see the remains of the ship that had just exploded. He tells Cheju that he would have torn to pieces if he had teleported just 0.1 seconds late. The fire from the ship's explosion is still seen throughout space, and bits from the ship float around. Standing on one large piece that broke away from Elena's ship, Seryung asks Lee if he's insane because they could have been killed. She asks him if in the past, people in the middle of the ocean ever set their own ship on fire just because they were angry, and tells him he should have shown some restraint. Lee, who has some blood coming out of his mouth, struggles to speak and tells her restraint wasn't an option. Seryung rushes to his side and asks him if he's hurt when she sees the blood. Kim just continues to look up, and he tells her that he faced a much stronger power than he had anticipated. Seryung looks up to where his gaze is fixed and realizes what he's looking at. Floating in space, along with all the rubble from the ship, is Elena's naked body and broken weapon. The captain asks him if she's dead since she's just floating there and not moving a muscle. With his gaze still fixed on Elena's floating body, he tells her that she's not dead just yet. Suddenly, a strange woman appears and retrieves Elena's unconscious body. Lee tells her that the impact of the sword didn't kill the 8-foot ghost, because a stronger force than he expected protected her, referring to this strange woman. The strange woman looks at Elena with sympathy in her eyes and covers up her nakedness. She has an angelic beauty about her, and she continues to stare at Elena's body in gloom. Suddenly, a light from a large overhead ship appears over them, and the woman takes up the 8-foot fighting ghost. Seryung immediately recognizes the woman as the West Heaven Sword Matron, and Kim recognizes her as his mother. It appears that this must be the mother who had given Elena the ring that she refused to pay attention to. The West Heaven Sword Matron carries the body into her ship and doesn't say anything to any of the onlookers. Lee just stares at her in surprise, still wielding the heart sword. Inside the West Heaven Sword Matron's ship, we see a pool of green chemicals. Inside this liquid, Elena's unconscious body floats, and it appears that the liquid is supposed to help her recuperate from her injuries. Her mother stands in front of the tube, staring at her, hoping that she becomes conscious soon enough. Her mother has a very distraught look on her face as she continues staring at Elena, who is inside the tube. Shortly after, Kim, Seryung, Hwa-rin, and Lee appear right behind her, and it seems she had summoned them to have a chat. Kim bows down before his mother as a show of submission. Meanwhile, Seryung holds Hwa-rin's hand to comfort her because she appears to be very afraid. Kim tells his mother that he didn't know she was coming and asks her to punish him for his lack of loyalty and filial piety. She doesn't even let him conclude his speech and tells him this is not his place to intervene, making it clear that this isn't the room for little children like him to talk. She tells him to act as if he isn't here, which really hurts Kim, who remains submissive to his mother. She walks up to Lee and makes a sign of respect with her hands, introducing herself as the West Heaven Sword Matron. Kim is terribly shocked to see his mother showing respect, and Seryung is equally shocked to see her showing an ounce of courtesy. The West Heaven Sword Matron apologizes to Lee for violating the dueling code of martial arts by rudely intervening in their duel, because she was driven by familial affections. She tells him she can cut off her arm as an apology if he so wishes, but Lee tells her there'll be no need for that. He asks her if Elena is her daughter, and notices Elena is in a tube. Seryung walks up to Lee and whispers to him that he is talking to the West Heaven Sword Matron and tells him to speak more respectfully. The West Heaven Sword Matron responds to him that Elena is indeed her daughter. Lee responds to her that it's settled it in that case because family takes precedence over the dueling code. Meanwhile, in the room, there seem to be many other tubes, like the one Elena is in, that are empty. Seryung whispers to him again and begs him to speak politely to the woman because she is one of the 5 immortals. Seryung continues by telling him that the West Heaven Sword Matron's temper is so bad that she can split you in 2 just by glaring at you. While she's talking, something that shocks her happens, and she shuts her mouth. Suddenly, the West Heaven Sword Matron goes on her knees to make obeisance to Lee, and this really shocks Seryung. Outside the ship, several ships from the 72 strongholds of Greenwood are still seen outside waiting for Kim. Later on, the West Heaven Sword Matron has a private discussion with our guy at the top of her ship. She tells him that her daughter's consciousness has not yet recovered, so she doesn't know the exact reason she attacked their ship or Hwa-rin. She tells him that she was only able to confirm that Elena passed through Mount Hua before she came there, so she was most likely commissioned to find Hwa-rin by a client while she was in Mount Hua. Lee just stares at the space around them absently and doesn't say a thing. She tells him that she noticed that the martial art that he had just demonstrated is the Demon Heart Sura sword technique and refers to him as a revered master. She asks him if he has any relation to the Heavenly Demon sect. Lee doesn't give her a direct answer, and he tells her he doesn't know. He says there was a deep connection in the past, but time has passed, and that's not certain anymore. He continues by saying that time corrodes even the strongest bonds as if they were iron. Meanwhile, Hwa Rin and Seryung wait nearby in another part of the ship. Our guy continues by saying that time also dissolves connections that are dearer than life itself, and Kim eavesdrops on the conversation from inside the ship. The West Heaven Sword Matron just stares at him blankly, not knowing what to make of him. She says within herself that he is indeed an extraordinary figure. His chi, internal energy, and martial arts are all perfectly refined and have no trace of artificiality. She wonders how that's possible since such a state was only achievable during the peak period of martial arts. Kim doesn't pay her any attention but keeps staring deep into space. The West Heaven Sword Matron keeps looking at him and considers that he appears to be in his early 20s and wonders if this is some sort of rejuvenation. She breaks the ice and asks Lee if she can make a request, still referring to him as the revered master. Lee speaks out her mind and asks if she's proposing a serious fight, and it surprises her that he was able to detect what she was thinking. He continues by telling her that she may be very polite, but every word she says is dripping with murderous intent, like a sword sharpened against a flint that is getting sharper by the minute. The West Heaven Sword Matron commends his sharp ears for being able to catch her small whispers. He tells her that he's never refused a challenge, but he reminds her that if they fight, one of them is bound to die. The only issue is that the one left standing will be severely injured because something too strong has no room to bend and will break. The West Heaven Sword Matron starts to awaken her internal energy and accepts her fate, still hoping for a chance to fight. Seryung notices the matron's awakening and becomes worried that trouble is brewing. While the matron is still awakening, Lee asks her if they have any compelling reason to fight while still looking at the scenery outside the ship. The West Heaven Sword Matron is caught off guard by his question. He glances at her and tells her that they can fight if they have reason to in the future, because he's more preoccupied with his desire to see more of the world right now. She stops her awakening, intrigued by the way he speaks. She decides to stop her transformation altogether and accept his offer. Meanwhile, the West Heaven Sword Matron's ship as well as the Greenwood fleet are seen all over that area of space. Moments later, the S-Devils leave the vicinity, as it appears that Lee and the West Heaven Sword Matron are done with their discussion. Later, Kim and his mother have a discussion, and she learns from him that the kill request was made by the Heavenly Demon Sect to prevent some secret from leaking. Kim, who still kneels in submission, reaffirms what he had just told her about the Heavenly Demon Sect. She tells him she can't seem to wrap her head around why the Heavenly Demon Sect would want to kill those in the S-Devil ship, and what secret they wouldn't want to be leaked out. She mentions that Lee clearly possessed the supreme martial arts of the Heavenly Demon Sects, and it doesn't make any sense that they would want him dead since he is one of them. Furthermore, she reasons that it doesn't make any sense that they would hire Greenwood to do their dirty bidding. Kim informs her that there's been recent information that the Heavenly Demon's Red Wolf Squad was annihilated by an unknown entity, and suggests that they could be related to these people. His mother tells him that there's no need to overthink. She explains that whatever the situation may be, his imagination won't be able to deduce it, and this stings Kim. She orders him to thoroughly track their movements and report to her, since that should be enough for him to handle. Kim boasts that they from Greenwood pride themselves on being the best in the world at tracking, and he informs her that he belongs to Greenwood's command. His mother just looks at him and doesn't say a word. Kim also remains on his knees, expecting her response. She tells him that she will trust him to track them, and tells him not to interfere in their business. She adds that she wouldn't want her child to get hurt, and the Black Tiger's eyes widen as he hears her words of maternal care. He looks behind him and mutters the word, mother. And it's clear that all of the West Heaven Sword Matron's kids seem to have some abandonment issues from their mother's end, since she has so many children. Before she leaves the room, she asks him one last question. He eagerly turns back to hear the question, and she asks him what his name is, and Kim just stares at her in shock. Meanwhile, in the S-Devil ship, Hwa Rin hides behind Lee when Seryung shouts at her and demands to know what mess she has gotten herself into this time. Seryung looks really angry, and you can almost see fumes coming out of her nostrils as she speaks. She asks Hwa Rin what she did to get involved with Greenwood, the 8-foot fighting ghost Elena, and worse of all, the Heaven Sword Matron. She asks to know if Hwa Rin had flipped the world upside down before coming here. Outside the ship, the vast expanse of space seems calm, as there are no ships or seasoned martial artists trying to kill each other. Hwa Rin looks gloomy and sincerely apologizes for all the trouble and confesses that she also doesn't know why they're all after her. She tells them that after she finished her tour, she returned to Mount Hua, her hometown, and everything was suddenly different. They sit on the table to talk, and Sunja prepares a mountain of hot dogs for Lee to devour. Hwa Rin tells them that when she got back to her hometown, the people from her hometown were suddenly trying to kill her. She explains that she ran away from her town all the way to this place. Meanwhile, Lee speedily stuffs his mouth with like 7 hot dogs and at the same time he grabs another 4 with his other arm, clearly ignoring the conversation. Seryung says she has no idea what Hwa Rin is talking about and turns around to ask Sunja if she has any idea either. Sunja looks just as confused and says she also finds it hard to grasp. Hwa Rin just keeps silent, unsure of how else to explain her dilemma to them, while Lee spills pieces of meat everywhere due to his frantic eating. Suddenly, one of the pieces of meat mistakenly enters Hwa Rin's mouth, and she tries to bring it out, but she becomes shocked when Robert slams his hands on the table, demanding to know if she just mentioned Mount Hwa. He angrily pushes Seryung aside and asks if she is referring to the Mount Hwa planet, which is also his hometown. The girl mistakenly swallows the meat caught in her mouth, and it starts to choke her, which makes her cough. But Lee doesn't even notice at all because he's eating like a beast. Robert demands that she immediately tell him what happened at Mount Hwa while Hwa Rin continues to cough. Watching the conundrum, Sunja just frowns and mentions that humans are utterly abnormal. Meanwhile, in the West Heaven Sword Matron's ship, we see that one of her big tubes seems to have been shattered. Out of the shattered tube, Elena's now conscious body falls to the ground, and she begins to cough in the presence of the West Heaven Sword Matron. Her mother just looks at her worriedly and leaves her to cough and come to her senses. She immediately asks her what happened to her on Mount Hwa, but Elena continues to cough profusely. Elena, who is still struggling to catch her breath, finally bears herself up and glances at her mother. Next up, we return to the Wild Crane Inn, where Lee had met with the Red Wolf Squad. Inside the inn, the keeper of the inn, Wang the 18th, watches footage of Lee's encounter with Elena. He watches on screen as she makes her moves, and he dodges them. He also watches Lee use the heart sword when he gets tired of dodging her attacks, which causes the explosion that ripped through space. Wang watches with excitement with his guards behind him, who also watch in great surprise. He recalls his conversation with Seryung and recalls when she asked him how much a full collection of 2,000-year-old martial arts manuscripts is worth. He recalls that she had said they were all originals and were S rank. In the present, he is shocked to learn she was telling the truth and he had passed on a deal that could be potentially worth a fortune. We return to the Heavenly Demon Sect, District 32. The footage of Elena launching towards Lee, who just stands there, is played on the screen. Soon after, Elena is seen trying to land multiple strikes on Lee, which he dodges seamlessly. A look of horror develops on the face of the District 32 commander, Jong Ritak. He watches in horror and asks what's going on as he sees Lee wielding the heart sword to finish off Elena. From behind him, the West Heaven Sword Matron asks what he thinks of the footage, and says the martial art seems to be quite familiar, and he looks back towards her. She stares at him and waits for his, hoping that he'll pick that the martial art is related to the demon sect. Yang acknowledges that it is a level of martial art prowess never seen or heard of before, but he tells her he doesn't understand what she means by saying it's familiar. The sword matron just stares at him blankly, wondering if he truly doesn't know anything about the new person that just showed up on their radar. Zhang also stares at her, standing on his point that the martial art doesn't seem familiar. The sword matron thinks to herself that it really seems that he doesn't have a clue that the martial art that Lee used is connected to their heavenly demon sect. She asks him why he decided to pursue our guy and why he had involved Greenwood. The commander tells her that is an internal matter of their sect, and it's not something that she should concern herself with even though she is the sword matron who rules over the West Heaven Cosmic Zone. He frowns sternly and stands on his point, but the left side of his neck is suddenly cut. John suffers a cut to his neck and it starts to bleed. Meanwhile, the sword matron wields her sword, and it's clear that she had managed to cut him from where she's standing in the twinkle of an eye. She suddenly develops an evil aura around her and continues to hold out her sword, implying that she'd get the information whether he wants to give it or not. Zhang, on the other hand, has the fabric around his neck area cut and only suffers surface damage to his skin, which means that she could have gone deeper if she wanted to, but had decided to spare his life. The commander places a hand over his neck to stop the bleeding, and asks her if she's declaring war against their demon sect. She playfully asks him if he thinks that she of all people would fear bloodshed. He looks at her, still holding his neck to stop the blood from coming out. He reasons that she's a woman who, driven by obsession with martial arts, even devoured her own children. Yang decides that she's not one who considers profit or loss to herself when she pursues her obsession for martial arts. It's clear where Elena got her passion from. The sword matron's sword starts to burn with a bright red fire and it looks like it's about go to down. She begins to awaken, and a purple flame covers the entire room, and she asks him if he will answer or choose to die. He tells her that the choice is obvious, because even if all the 1076 martial artists of District 32 attack her together, they can't surpass the strength of the sword matron. So it's clear that he has chosen to die. He activates his own martial power and generates fire in both his hands and proposes that they begin the fight even though he knows it'll lead to his doom. He tells her she better hurry if she plans to cut down all 1076 of them. The West Heaven Sword. Moran just smiled at him, intrigued by his resolve. She thinks about how people say that the heavenly demon sect gets tougher each passing day, so she decides to let it go. She tells him that the method used by the unknown person that they're dealing with is the Demon Heart Sura sword technique. Zhang, who is still planning on fighting with a murderous intent in his eyes, is shocked to hear her mention that the martial art is connected to the demon sect. He asks what she means by that. The sword matron repeats that the heart sword that cut down her daughter was the Demon Heart Sura sword technique, second in the heavenly demon sect's martial hierarchy. The commander is sincerely surprised to hear her assertion, and tells her that can't be possible because the Demon Heart Sura sword technique has been a lost martial art for thousands of years. He says that it exists only in legends, and no one in their sect has ever practiced it. The sword matron responds to that by saying that it's not her problem that his knowledge is lacking. She tells him that she's told him what she knows, so she asks him again why he chose to pursue the fellow they're talking about. She refers to the image of Lee on the screen and asks why he chose to pursue him. Zhang keeps quiet and stares at her for a while, contemplating whether he should divulge the information. He tells her that they weren't after Lee. He points to Hua Rin and says she was the one they were chasing after. Meanwhile, in a place called the Talaviatra orbiting star system, the S-Devils come to Robert and Hua Rin's home planet, the Mount Hua planet. They fly into its atmosphere and proceed to land on its surface. They reach Hua Rin's county, called Hua Hum County, and the place looks like ancient Japan and looks pretty peaceful. The county looks pretty much deserted because all the shops are abandoned and not a single person is seen everywhere. No matter where you look, all the lights are on and the homes look clean, but no one can be seen. When they enter the planet, Seryung asks Hua Rin what's wrong and why the land is completely empty. She asks why no one is there, wondering if there's some sort of holiday. Robert looks around in horror and says he doesn't think so because all the store doors are open. They soon touch down and look through the camera and see all the stores open with several market utensils on the ground unattended to. Sunja tells them that the town has over 10,000 inhabitants, but she can't seem to detect any signs of life at all. Robert becomes frantic again and starts to shake the captain. He insists that something must have surely happened and says they should go down quickly. He says something terrifying must have happened, and everyone surely died or fled. Seryung tries to calm him down and asks why he's so agitated all of a sudden. He tells her that Mount Hua is his hometown, and screams that they have to save Mount Hua. Seryung tries to get out of his grip and starts to cough. She tells him to let go because she can't breathe. While she tries to make him let go of her clothes, tears drop from Hua Rin's eyes as she looks through her deserted homeland. Hua Rin cries deeply, while Lee just stares at the scenery of the planet. He asks her what's going on and tells her to speak up if she knows anything about why the place is deserted. She hesitates before she talks, and it seems she knows quite a bit about it. Before she can talk, Sunja tells them that she has detected a life signal. Sunja's words catch their attention, and they quickly turn to hear what she has to say. The android tells them that the life signal is coming from the Jaha Pavilion, inside Mount Hua's main headquarters, judging from its location. Robert stops struggling with Seryung when he recognizes the Jaha Pavilion and mentions that the Jaha Pavilion is where the leader of the Mount Hua sect resides. Sunja affirms what he said, but tells him that the life signal is strong, but seems to be coming from just one person. Hua Rin doesn't say anything and just keeps quiet, and it seems she knows who the person is. Later on, they successfully reach the Jaha Pavilion at night. The building looks grand, but currently seems eerie and covered in smoke. They all stand at the entrance and wonder what the eerie-looking building could possibly hold. Seryung looks back when she hears a loud sound. It turns out to be Robert, who is wearing some sort of Iron Man suit, and she asks him what he's doing. He tells her that whoever is in the Jaha Pavilion is part of those who touched his homeland, and he doesn't plan to forgive any of them. Seryung just asks him if his combat suit is still functional. She mentions that she thought he stashed it away in the warehouse as soon as he got discharged and later sold it off. Robert insists that once a Special Force soldier, always a Special Force soldier, and boasts that he always oil and polishes the suit every day. When they get closer to a tunnel opening in front of the pavilion, the captain asks Sunja if the signal is still there through the comms. She asks her if she's still detecting a response just to be sure they aren't chasing after the wind. Sunja responds that the life signal is getting stronger and tells them to be careful because it doesn't seem to be human. Seryung takes note of the information and suggests that they deploy a reconnaissance drone first to help them identify what it is before they go in. Nearby, Robert exclaims when he hears that what they're after might not be human. Before the captain can finish her statement, Robert rushes into the tunnel, screaming out that he'll kill whatever it is, and threatens the monster to come out because the special forces are here. Seryung and Lee just watch him in surprise, not sure what to say. The captain mentions how odd it is that he's causing a ruckus just because they're in his hometown. She decides that there's no need to send a drone since Mr. Patriot must have alerted the target with all his noise, so they proceed to the opening and she tells the rest of them to stay alert. Just before they step into the tunnel, a pool of fire comes out of the tunnel and heads right for them. Se-ryung notices the bright light and is shocked, wondering what it could be. The stream of fire issues from the tunnel and burns all that's in its path. Hopefully, they're not going against a dragon. The fire is so strong that it runs past the tunnel in front of the Aha Pavilion and reaches across to the houses that were built in front of it. Soon after, the stream of fire retracts back into the tunnel, and everything calms down again. Se-ryung is shocked by what had just happened and remains speechless. Hwa-rin is also shocked that such a great inferno has just brushed past them, and they're alive. How they're alive is the funny part. Both ladies are seen pressed towards each other to avoid the fire, and the position is quite embarrassing. It turns out Lee had quickly carried both of them on his legs and created a shield that blocked the fire to keep them alive. Lee doesn't even notice their compromising position and looks deeper into the tunnel, wondering where the fire came from. Se-ryung snaps to her senses and looks behind him, asking where the fire suddenly came from. Our guy suggests they move forward and drop Se-ryung on her back, but helps Hwa-rin to her feet. Se-ryung drops on her back and lets out a groan of pain. When they move forward, they run into Robert, whose suit seems to have been badly burned, and they wonder if he's dead or alive. Se-ryung moves closer to him and asks him to say something if he's alive, but he just remains frozen as if he's been roasted to death. The captain signals Sunja through the comms and asks her to scan him to know if he's still alive. Sunja runs a scan on the system and assures them that he's fine because, fortunately for him, his combat suit did its job. Se-ryung wonders why he's not talking if he's still alive, and Sunja tells her that he's probably just scared out of his mind. The captain exclaims when she realizes the problem and gives Robert more time to become conscious. Meanwhile, Lee checks out the tunnel and wonders where the sudden fire came from. When he looks up, he sees a streak of pink lightning, which catches his attention. As he looks closer, he notices something littered around the end of the tunnel. It turns out to be small pink flower petals that are making these streaks of light. The petal lands on our guy's hair and shatters due to how fragile it is, which puzzles him. Suddenly, the entire tunnel fills up with thousands of other flower petals out of nowhere. Moving forward, they see that the flower petals are emanating from a man who seems to be sitting down on a throne. The man turns out to be the leader of the Mount Hua sect, and he just sits on his throne with his eyes closed, enveloped with strong energy, and he seems unaware of their presence. Lee frowns as he looks at him, still wondering what's going on. Se-ryung also sees him and asks Sunja if the man they're looking at is the source of the life-form signal. Sunja tells her that he is the source, and he must be the leader of Mount Hua. Sunja introduces him as Flourishing Blossom Sword Sovereign Yeongjok-san, and this shocks Se-ryung. She looks at him more closely and is shocked to learn that the man is the Sword Sovereign of Mount Hua. Lee reaches out and catches one of the plum blossom flowers and looks at it closely. He says that the fact that the plum blossoms opened from the heat means that he's achieved the peak of the plum blossom heavenly fragrance heart technique. As the plum blossom shatters in his hands and gives out a purple color, he wonders why they have bloomed in purple. He reasons that this means that the plum blossom heavenly fragrance technique has mixed with another technique called the purple mist divine heart. Meanwhile, Yang just sits there and ignores their presence, with streaks of pink and purple light coming out of his body. Meanwhile, Hwa-rin stares at him with tears rolling down from her eyes. Oddly enough, she calls him Dad. It appears that the Sword Sovereign, who seems to be completely unaware of his surroundings, is Hwa-rin's father. Lee just stands there staring at Yang, and he thinks to himself that this situation doesn't look good at all. Yang sits on his throne, oblivious to their presence, and it seems he's in his own zone. Se-ryung walks up to Lee and asks what the problem is. He tells her that the plum blossom heavenly fragrance heart technique embodies extreme yang, while the purple mist divine art embodies extreme yin. Thus, even the elders of Mount Hua can only choose one to master. He tells her to consider that extreme yang is fire and extreme yin is water, and asks her what she thinks will happen when they mix. He answers his own question by saying that when a martial artist's desires surpass their limits, a demon takes root in their heart, and that person is no longer human. Lee starts to summon the heart sword like he did before he defeated Elena, and it looks like he plans to take out Yang because he's been taken over by a demon. He tells Se-ryung to take the others and flee because the fight won't be an easy one. As he awakens into his energy state and a pure aura fills the air, he tells her that even he can't guarantee their safety in such a fight. Before he can strike, Hwa-rin rushes towards Yang and calls him Dad. Se-ryung shouts and tells her to stop moving close to the man, but Hwa-rin just ignores her warnings. Meanwhile, Lee prepares to strike when he realizes it's too late to get them into safety. Sunja watches with surprise on her face, wondering what's to become of the girl. On the clock, it's just 2 seconds from 18 Sang, and Sunja realizes that the girl and everyone there are in danger. Meanwhile, Hwa-rin ignores all their warnings and just reaches out to hug her father, who's still spilling out streaks of lightning out of his body. The clock on the screen in front of Sunja shows that it's just 1 second from 18. Inside the tunnel, the girl hugs her father, and it seems the energy emanating from him doesn't affect her at all. Seryung's eyes widen as she stares at her, but our guy just watches to see what will happen. Suddenly, the blossoms and the light around the throne turn a bright yellow and begin to disappear. Yang gets up from his seat and hugs Hua-Rin, and it seems he can now sense her presence. He looks down at her with paternal love and holds her head as he embraces her. The captain is more than freaked out and asks what the heck is going on and why the man suddenly switched from a terrifying monster to a loving father. Sunja tells them over the comms that this is normal because the world has returned to normal. Inside the ship, Sunja watches the screen in disbelief, and Seryung asks her what she's talking about. The android tells her that everything is normal now. On the screen, it shows that the time is a few seconds past 18 Rao. Meanwhile, in the city, people seem to be walking around like nothing had happened. Sunja keeps looking through their cameras, and she tells them that she sees people on the streets. She keeps looking everywhere, and it seems that people have started to move around in all the places that seemed deserted before. There are couples walking around, people walking around to buy things, and many more. Sunja explains that the people who disappeared seem to have returned. Meanwhile, Yang still continues hugging Hua-Rin. Seryung continues watching the scenery in front of her, and she can't wrap her head around the fact that every missing person seems to have appeared at once. Lee, on the other hand, doesn't seem a bit impressed, and he's seen to be watching with a frown. The people walk around the town at the dawn of the day, and they don't seem to be aware that nobody was in the town just a few minutes ago. Robert, Seryung, and Sunja go have a sit in one of the restaurants, and they seem disturbed by all that is going on. Seryung asks Sunja why she hadn't detected any life form, and asks her if the bioscanner was malfunctioning. Sunja, who's having a drink, tells her that they checked it together, and they had confirmed that the scanner was normal. The android connects to the scanner again and confirms that it's still normal even as they speak. As she scans the people, she notices that something is off about the people around them. She tells the bounty hunters that the people here all have their internal energy drained. Both adults and children don't seem to show any internal energy reading. Robert says that shouldn't be so much of a problem since the people look all right, but Seryung still feels quite uncomfortable. He tells them it's fine since they had thought they were dead before, but have now found out they're alive. He looks behind him and says he's hungry, so he decides to order some food. Robert waves to the attendant in the restaurant and tries to signal her to take his order. Seryung tells him that he was making such a fuss all just a while ago, and now he doesn't seem to care anymore. The waiter starts to walk towards them, so Robert mentions to them that she's coming over to take their orders. When she comes close to them, Robert tells her that he'll have a double serving of noodles and a large special dong pork. He suddenly notices something odd and stops talking. The server walks right past him, and she doesn't seem to pay attention to a word he said. Robert freezes with his hand still in the air, wondering if she just has bad customer service or she didn't hear him. He looks back and notices her attending to other customers and asks why she walked past him and wonders if she was too busy to hear him. When she heads back towards them, he's relieved she's coming back, so he shouts to her that he would like to make an order. The lady walks past him again and doesn't say a word, and it seems like he's not there. Robert freezes again with his hands in the air, and this time he just opens his mouth in confusion. He suddenly exclaims, wondering what is going on and why the waiter keeps ignoring him. Sunja helps him understand and tells him that it's not that she didn't hear him, but it's like the people around them can't see them at all. Sunja explains that no one in the restaurant has ever stopped to look at them. Even when they're right in front of them, they still pass by as if they're part of the scenery. She explains that they're not aware of their presence at all, and it's like they never existed in the first place. Seryung has a bad feeling about this, but she says she doesn't want to get involved and covers herself up because of the cold. Meanwhile, Yang is seen having his early morning tea right after he leaves the spot where he hugged Hua-Rin. He pours some tea from his teapot into small cups and sits down to enjoy the morning. He soon drinks the tea and enjoys himself, even while there are guests in front of him. Nearby, Hua-Rin explains to Lee that he's not someone who would rudely drink his tea alone while guests are in front of him. She calls out to him in fear, but he doesn't seem to be aware of their presence at all. She tells him that he can't see them, and that's why he's acting this way. She also informs him that he's been like this since she got back from her tour. Meanwhile, Yang continues to sip and enjoy his tea quietly. Hua-Rin tells Lee that the strange thing is that he does all his work and tasks normally. She says he goes for inspections, eats his meals, and tends to his gardens like he always does. She says that he does these things at exactly the same times every day, like a wind-up doll. Lee walks up to him and he looks freaked out. He waves in front of Yang's face, but he doesn't respond, so Hua-Rin tells him it's no use because he can't see them. She tells him he must be careful because something can go wrong if you prevent him from doing his repetitive routine. Lee, who didn't hear that part, drags Yang's cup out of his hands. Huarin panics and screams out that what he did was a really bad idea and tells him to get out of the way. Li, who is surprised to see her reaction, does not notice the Sword Sovereign swinging his sword towards his neck for interrupting him. Before the Sword Sovereign makes a full swing, our guy, who's always quick on his feet, bends backwards and dodges the attack. He looks up at the sword swing past him and realizes that it's about to go down. As he looks up towards Yang, who quickly directs his sword downwards and attempts to pin him to the ground with it. Li quickly rolls out of the way and avoids several quick movements of the sword's edge towards him. The Sword Sovereign moves at lightning-fast speed, but fortunately, our guy is equally as fast. The Sword Sovereign moves so fast that it seems that he's cutting with several swords at once, and Li doesn't have choice but to keep dodging. Yang creates an energy force in his hands and attempts to release it towards Li, who is standing right in front of him. Li becomes angry and tells him it's enough, rushing to meet him with his own energy force because it's dangerous to let him release it. Our guy rams his palms towards Yang's palm to stop the effect of his martial technique and prevent an explosion. The force released from both energy sources is so strong that it creates a great wave of explosion that rips through the room and almost injures Huarin. As she watches the fight, she screams out to Li to stop the fight. The weight of the explosion throws Yang backwards into the smoke, but Li still stands his ground. Yang gets back up with murderous intent in his eyes, and his entire body releases flashes of lightning. To think this is all because of a cup of tea. Our guy notices that he's showing the reaction of exhibiting extreme yang and yin together like he did in the tunnel. Huarin just shouts that the only way to stop him from continuing his rampage is to return his teacup to him. Li keeps looking at him, and he mentions that when a person tries to surpass an impossible limit, their body cannot withstand it. Thus, the principle should be that the person falls into inner demons. Their body bursts like a balloon, and they end up shredded in pieces. As he watches Yang increase in energy and walk towards him, Li wonders that what he's doing should clearly be an impossible realm to tread in, and he should have died. Yang keeps talking towards him, with a bearing fire around him as well as purple and pink light. Suddenly, a large plum blossom flower shows up again out of nowhere. The flower's pink exterior is corrupted with a purple color, and it moves before Yang, who is walking towards him, with a whirlwind around him. Li wonders that he seems to be a human, yet he's not a human at the same time, and he wonders why his situation is peculiar and what the story behind this is. Huarin screams out to him again and tells him to hurry because waiting for too long can be dangerous. The menacing and deadly-looking flower closes in on Li, who still remains crouched. Huarin watches the whole thing in dread, hoping that he's able to return the cup quickly. Li suddenly brings out the cup and prepares to throw. He swings backward so he can get enough traction to reach Yang. He soon throws it with great force, and the cup goes flying towards Yang. The cup flies towards the large and dreadful-looking plum blossom. The cup heads right for its center, and it seems that the flower will stop its movement. Fortunately, the cup tears through the center of the flower and goes right through it. As it tears through the flower explodes into a dark purple gas. Huarin watches in anticipation, hoping that the cup will reach her dad and all the fighting will stop. Suddenly, Yang catches the cup in midair, and it seems that was what he was fighting for all along. After the Sword Sovereign retrieves the cup, the pink fire and lightning around him start dimming quickly. The energy display around him stops after he catches the cup, and it looks like things are returning to normal. Yang returns back to his previous state and continues with his tea drinking in his small chair. He pours some more tea into the cup like he did previously and ignores the two people in the room like they're not there. Li frowns as he looks at him, realizing that one of them almost died just because of a teacup. Huarin looks slightly relieved to see that things have been resolved. Soon after, night comes and everything becomes dark again. Huarin tells Li about how she returned home after she finished her interstellar tour half a month ago. Meanwhile, Sunja, Seryung, and Robert walk amidst the people, wondering what's really going on. Hua tells Li that when she returned, she noticed that everything had changed. In the streets, the trio continues to walk through the streets, wondering if anyone can see them at all. Huarin tells our guy that all the people act as if they're wind-up dolls, and they keep repeating the same things at the same time, in exactly the same way. While still on the streets, Robert reaches out and tries to stop one of the men walking on the streets. Huarin tells Li that another odd thing happens if you try to stop any of the townspeople from doing their repetitive activities. On the streets, the man that Robert stops just stops on his tracks and doesn't turn at all. Robert speaks to the man and tells him that he would like to ask him about what's going on the planet, but the man seems quite busy on a call on his iPhone. Robert stops talking when he realizes that the man isn't answering him at all but continues on his phone. All of a sudden, he exclaims when he notices that the man has frozen right on the street and isn't moving a limb. Huarin tells Li that whenever you try to stop any of the people from doing their usual activities, they stop. Meanwhile, Robert tries to signal the man, but he doesn't get a response. Not just that, everyone stops moving. Huarin tells Li that something else happens after everyone stops moving. On the streets, Every person suddenly starts to fade away like they were never there in the first place. The man Robert stopped fades away right before his eyes, and he just looks at him, surprised. He's honestly shocked and wonders what's going on. He looks toward Sunja and asks her what just happened, and asks if they had just teleported. Sunja just stares at the people disappear too, and she tells him she doesn't know. Seryung looks at Sunja and asks her what she means by that because there's no one that can know if she doesn't. The android tells them that it seems like teleportation judging from the particle waveform, but the issue is that it's too large a scale. Seryung doesn't understand and asks her what she means by that, because she hadn't looked back to notice that everyone else had also disappeared. She and Robert look behind them, and they realize that they're all alone. She asks Sunja where everyone suddenly went to. Sunja just continues to scan the environment, and she tells them that all signs of life have disappeared from the entire planet. The captain is shocked to hear that and asks her to repeat what she just said. Meanwhile, Hua Rin tells Lee that when everyone disappears like that, something else happens. She looks outside towards the streets and tells him some strange creatures start to show up when people disappear like that. On the streets of the town, Seryung, Robert, and Sunja notice some odd things on the street. On the streets of the city, an army of robots marches towards them. They all match in a regular order, and a mist seems to suddenly cover the ground. Robert, Seryung, and Sunja stare at them in horror, and Robert asks what the heck those things are. The robots all seem to be wielding swords and continue to march towards them in a rhythmic order. The mist becomes stronger, and hundreds of robots come towards them from all directions. The captain answers that she's not sure either, but she says that it seems that they're in a very dangerous situation right now. She freezes on the spot and watches the robot walk towards them, unsure of where to go since they're trapped. She asks Sunja if they're androids while still looking at them. She also asks why they all look half-finished, since their abdominal region basically contains nothing but a connecting iron rod. Sunja scans them with her scanner and tells her that they're not androids, but construction droids. She explains that they are models created for simple labor like planetary development. Also, since they are early models, they're equipped with low-capacity AI, so their cognitive abilities are limited. Seryung slightly breathes a sigh of relief and says she freaked out for nothing since they're just construction droids. Seryung tells them that according to the 3 laws of robotics, droids can never harm a human, but Robert doesn't seem so sure. He notices they're holding swords and asks what construction droids would want to use them for. Seryung tells him they're probably using them in place of tools and walks towards the droids to signal them. She tells them there are people here and orders them to move aside and find another path so as not to crowd around and scare people. One of the droids runs towards her and tries to cut her nasty lips off. Before she can say Jack Robinson, it swings its swords towards her and tries to divide her in half, but she quickly releases an energy blast towards it. I always knew AI would take over the world. Fortunately, the blast gives her enough of a push to move out of the way and avoid the cut. She angrily looks at the droid and asks it what the heck it's doing and wonders if it's malfunctioning. Their response to her question shocks her, as several of them leap towards her with swords in her hands. They jump around like ninjas and proceed to cut her in pieces with her long, pointy swords. To stop them all at once, Seryung releases a large energy explosion towards them using her martial arts skill. From the Jaha Pavilion, Hua Rin and Lee see the large explosion rip through the city. She tells Lee that these are the things that she was talking about, and they always show up when the people disappear. In the streets, Seryung keeps releasing fire at the robots while Sunja clings to her waist to save her dear life, and Robert runs away like a wuss. Hua Rin tells Lee that the robots always attack every living thing they see. Meanwhile, the trio jumps on a roof and the robots follow them, hell-bent on tearing them to pieces. A swarm of robots are seen on the roof and on the ground, and it looks like there's nowhere to run. Hua Rin tells Lee that she was also attacked when she came back home after finishing her tour. She looks towards the left to look at her father's T-spot when she hears him leaving. She finds the spot empty and tells Lee that she wouldn't have survived if it were not for her father. Yang goes back to his throne and continues his meditation. Hua Rin tells Lee that for some reason, the robots never come to where her father is. Meanwhile, Yang returns back to his throne and rests his arm on it. He sits down, and the place starts to burn with a pinkish fire once more, like it did when they had just arrived. He soon closes his eyes, and his entire surroundings are enclosed with the pink fire again. As he goes deeper in his meditation, the bright pink light bursts out and the plum blossoms show up again. Hua Rin also tells Lee that if everyone disappears, only her dad seems to remain. The only bad part is that he remains in that state and cannot be reached. Lee looks right at him and tells her that Yang is trying to hang on. She turns to look at him and asks him what he means by that. He tells her that he's hanging on by burning his entire internal energy along with his soul, ready to face inner demons if he has to. It seems this has been the way he hasn't been destroyed. Lee puts a hand on Hua Rin's head and tells her it seems that there is something that Yang is trying to protect no matter what, referring to her. She just stares at her father with pity in her eyes, wondering what he must be going through. Our guy mentions that the Sword Sovereign's actions are quite admirable. He suddenly walks out of the chamber and tells her to follow him so he can take care of all this. The girl is shocked at his abrupt exit and asks him where they're going. He doesn't turn back, and he tells her he wants to take a good look at the face of the scum responsible for this. Meanwhile, on the streets, Seryung, Sunja, and Robert escape to a dead end, and it seems there's nothing to do but to face the robots. They're surrounded by droids on all sides, and they wonder what to do before they're killed. The droids all stare at them with eerie red eyes, and they don't look like they're here to play. Seryung starts to stammer, and she asks why they're doing this, and why they're attacking humans. She asks Sunja if it's even normally possible for droids to attack humans. Sunja, who is hiding behind her, says that it's impossible because the intelligent systems of androids still cannot violate the 3 laws of robotics. Sunja continues that attacking humans isn't even an option for them. But it sure looks like it is. The captain asks her why these robots are acting like this, and wonders if they're malfunctioning or can't see them as humans. Robert starts to crunch the numbers from his knowledge while in the special forces and reasons that since androids can't attack humans, this may be the combat androids that he used to hear about. The robots suddenly leap towards them and proceed to impale them on every side since they're tired of their babbling, and the men brace for impact. Seryung brings out her sword and tells Sunja to hold on tight and to hide well to avoid being hit by their swords. Suddenly, several beams of light hit the flying robots right in midair. The beats hit them so hard that it splits some of them in pieces and disarms them of their swords. The impact releases a massive explosion in the sky as many of the robots explode. Seryung and Sunja stare in surprise, wondering who had suddenly come to save them. Right behind them, Robert shows up with his combat suit again and comes in guns blazing. He suddenly announces that they're not droids. He tells them that they're something called Iron Gangshi. P.S. Gangshi are reanimated corpses or zombies. The Iron Gangshi don't seem to give up because they've been found out and arranged themselves again to strike. Meanwhile, in a faraway place, someone named Count Richel watches the entire tussle on a screen. Another person introduces to him that the people on the screen are called Blazing Devil Tang Seryung, and next to her is PL003 16KBT intelligent android Suna, while looking at an image of them freaking out. She explains that the third person is the former First Sergeant of the Northern Galaxy Combat Unit, Special Tactical Division, Robert Carlyle. The person making the presentation appears to be another Iron Gangshi, and she explains to her boss that the S-Devils are a group of bounty hunters mostly operating in the outskirts of the galaxy. She mentions that they're not a threat and they can be eliminated within 10 seconds. Her boss asks her if she had just said that Robert was from the Northern Galaxy Combat Unit. While he looks at the image of Robert going in guns blazing and whooping Gangshi behind, he confirms if he's also from the Special Tactical Division. The Gangshi asks him if she should issue the order to eliminate them. He looks at the screen with his half-metallic face and considers the next course of action. Meanwhile, Lee reaches the spot where the guys are fighting the Gangshi. He notices several broken robotic parts on the ground and asks what seems to be going on. The fight seems to have ended, so he asks them how the fight is already over when they were just fighting a moment ago. Several robotic parts are seen littered on the ground and even on the roof. Robert responds to him and gloats that he went all out on the robots this time. He mentions that he's been waiting every day for a day like this, and that explains why he hasn't thrown away his suit. He flexes his suit for a bit to show them it's nice and fully functional. He boasts to have kept everything well-oiled just waiting for a day like this, and Lee just stares at him in surprise. When he sarcastically asks what would have happened today if he had listened to someone and sold his equipment as second-hand, obviously referring to Seryung, she just frowns and folds her arm, tired of him yapping. Robert explains that they were forced to have to sell it back then because they were pressed for cash and needed money for food ingredients. While he boasts about how they would not have been able to deal with them today had he not held out, Lee picks up one of the robotic hands and examines it. Sunja bursts Robert's bubbles and tells him that they didn't deal with the Gangshi, but they retreated on their own, and they wouldn't have survived if they had kept attacking them. Lee holds up the metal hand and wonders what it is, thinking it's part of an armor. Seryung tells him it's not part of an armor, but it's a droid, or rather a robot. He tries to pronounce what she said and calls it a drobot. He tells her to talk in a way he understands because he can't understand what she's saying. They never had robots in his civilization, and he can't even conceive the idea. Seryung just decides to rest somewhere because she's tired, and tells him he wouldn't understand even if she explains to him. So she asks Sunja to summarize it for him. Sunja explains to him to think of a robot as a machine that can think and act like a person. He looks totally stunned and says that no matter how much the world has changed, it's not possible that a chunk of metal could mimic a human. Something suddenly happens that freaks Lee out. Sunja takes off her head and stretches it out to him to prove her point graphically. Our guy loses his mind and starts to scream. He runs behind Hua Rin and almost knocks her to the ground, demanding to know what sort of creature Sunja is. Seryung gets up and asks Sunja if she hadn't told him that she was an android, but Sunja tells her that they've been busy. Meanwhile, one of the destroyed Gangxi that still has its intelligence unit seems to be active. It opens its eyes and looks right at the group, who seem oblivious to its activity. He records Lee picking up Hua Rin and hiding behind her. Meanwhile, the Gangxi that was explaining to Count Richel connects to the life feed and tells him our guy isn't registered on the database. In the secret hideout, they watch the footage on the Skuren, and the Gangxi adds that Lee doesn't seem to be mounted with an internal energy drive, and this indicates that he's a pure natural. Count Richel gets up to leave and tells them that, judging from our guy's foolish actions, he's not someone to worry about. He tells them that the person they need to be worried about is Robert. He says that he must be an elite soldier if he's from the Special Tactical Division of the Galaxy Combat Unit. The Count also believes that he must be the best of the best if he's a first sergeant. He reasons to himself that someone like Robert wouldn't have come to this place by coincidence without a definite purpose, so he orders them to be thoroughly vigilant and investigate him. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the vast expanse of the galaxy, a bright star appears. It turns out it's not a star, but a transport ship that's traveling through space. The location seems to be no other place than the 32nd district of the Heavenly Demon Sect. Inside the district commander, Zhang, and the district's elder, Zhou, await the entrance of their special guest. Moments later, their guest's transport ship enters their district, and the doors open for him to come out. He comes out wearing some flip-flops, and he looks rather chill. He walks towards the commander and elder, who bow their heads as they receive him as a sign of respect, since he's higher up in the chain of command. The commander thanks him for coming such a long way to see them and refers to him as an officer. He yawns tiredly and agrees that it was quite a long journey. The officer seems to be a boss baby, and he tells them his long journey better be worth all the effort. He is Cho Dane, the first-class officer of the Disaster Safety Headquarters Central Committee of the Heavenly Demon Sect. They get straight to business, and Cho inspects the bulging red mark on Sanjin's head where Lee had slapped him. Sanjin is seen in a wheelchair, and it's clear he's still recovering from the physical and mental impact of the experience. Commander Yang asks Officer Cho if there's anything he notices. The officer looks freaked out, and he looks closely at the weird hand mark on Sanjin's head. He stands on a stool because he's not so tall, and he continues to stare at the mark without uttering a word. Finally, Cho lays a hand on the mark and asks Sanjin if it hurts. Sanjin answers that the pain has greatly subsided, but he mentions that his head still feels a persistent heat. Cho asks him to repeat what he said so he can clarify, and he wonders how there's still heat and no pain. Sanjin looks down, still dejected from the experience, and affirms that this is what has been happening to him. Suddenly, Sanjin experiences a great deal of pain when something happens. The officer presses his head again and does the same move that Lee had done to him, causing him to groan out in pain. Once beaten, twice shy. The loudness of the squad leader's screams fills the entire medical lab. Over the larger mark that Lee had made, Officer Cho's smaller hands make a smaller mark, but Sanjin can't complain because he's his superior. After the officer removes his hands, a smoke rises from the spot he had placed his hands on, just like it did after Lee did it. He puts his hands on his chin and continues to ponder the situation. The commander realizes what he's getting at, so he tells him that this previous mark is quite different because the original scar is swollen, but the second one is rather indented, so it doesn't seem like the same martial art technique. Cho doesn't look at him, but he tells him they're the same. He tells him the previous scar is the same scar from the 9 yin palm technique. The commander looks at him in shock, because this confirms the sword matron's words that this unidentified person has some relationship with the Heavenly Demon Sect. Later on, the commander tries to explain that the 9 yin palm is the lowest tier martial art taught to any introductory disciple in their sect, and this new technique is much more advanced. While they talk, Elder Joe goes to bring some food for their visitor since he must be starving. The commander continues by saying that he had also mastered the 9 yin palm technique at the age of 7. Meanwhile, the elder sets the table. Zhang tells him that the scar from the 9 yin palm seems to be quite different from the original scar that was made. The officer agrees with him and says that the essence of the 9 yin palm lies in cold energy, but this one left behind heat instead, so the scars would naturally be different. The officer tells them that whoever did this has reached a level where he can perfectly suppress the fundamental coldness of the 9 yin palm and leave only the heat of the impact. Officer Cho explains that it's an active consideration that the person did to avoid hurting the enemy. The commander is honestly shocked, and he stammeringly asks if it's even possible to reverse the fundamental nature of martial arts, since that is like making fire out of ice. Cho tells him that it's theoretically possible while he waits for his food to cool down. When he gets hungry, he tells the commander to leave the discussion for now and asks if they can eat first, and offers him some black bean noodles. Commander Zhang just frowns at him, wondering how he can think of food at such a pressing time. He eventually agrees. No point thinking hard with an empty stomach. Meanwhile, on the Manhwa planet, the team returns back into the S-Devil ship, and Robert tells everyone that those things they fought are called iron gangshi. Sunja drops another mountain of hot dogs before Lee, and Seryung glares at him. It's alarming the rate at which this guy eats. She joins in on the food and asks Robert to explain what iron gangshas are. Robert tells them that it was a rumor he heard while he was still in service. Apparently, they were developing a new type of combat android that includes killing humans in its parameters. Seryung tells him that's ridiculous because android intelligence circuits are designed based on the 3 laws of robotics and they can't harm humans. Meanwhile, Lee, who still can't wrap his head around the fact that Sunja isn't human, tries to pull on her cheeks to see what it's made of. But she just frowns while he does this. Robert responds to Seryung that to bypass the 3 laws of robots, they replace the intelligence circuits with the brains of deceased humans, and this revelation shocks Seryung. He tells them that is exactly why it's called the Iron Gangshi Project. Lee, who is still examining Sunja's face, asks her one more time if she's really not human just to confirm. She asks him if he would like her to take off her head again for him to see, and also offers to disassemble her arms and legs, just so he can be sure. Our guy quickly tells her there will be no need for that and says that this world has become bizarre, still looking totally stunned. He decides to leave her alone and focus on the food. Seryung continues her chat with Robert and tells him that what he's saying makes sense based on the fact that they attacked him, but it's too absurd to believe if she hadn't seen it for herself. Meanwhile, Lee freezes when he realizes the plate is empty, and the duo has finished all that hot dog while he was examining Sunja. Seryung notices Lee glancing at her, and she looks at him and says that it's really insane that someone would use the brains of dead people. She is met with a cold stare from Lee, who stares in horror upon realizing there's no more food. The captain doesn't realize why he's looking at her like that, so she asks him what's wrong and why he's making the face. When she looks down and notices the tray is empty, she exclaims and figures it out. She quickly orders Sunja to grill more hot dogs to feed him to avoid trouble. Sunja looks at her blankly and tells her that they're out of hot dogs. Seryung just dismisses it and says then there's nothing they can do, so she returns to the discussion about getting a clear grasp of what is going on the planet. She turns away from the table and says that it feels to her that they're caught in a rather unlucky situation. Behind her, Lee suddenly exclaims about how they're disrespectful beings and suddenly starts to light up, which makes Seryung turn back. He angrily says that even if the era of the martial world's etiquette is gone, it's alarming that she had the guts to steal his food. Seryung is alarmed and asks Robert what the heck Lee is saying, but he just tells her he has no clue. Our guy starts to awaken, and he says that she doesn't have the excuse of not knowing his true identity, because he had declared himself to be the supreme heavenly demon, and asks what gave her the guts once more. She puts a hand on her waist and recalls that he did say he was the supreme heavenly demon, and Robert also remembers. Such disrespect. She mulls over it and can't make any sense of what that would even mean. The captain just ignores him and turns around, saying it's confusing, but they'll deal with that later since they have bigger priorities right now. Meanwhile, Lee is still burning hot with anger. Robert gets uncomfortable sitting down with him at the dinner table and stops Seryung so they can leave together. Sunja also hastens out of the ship, trying to avoid Lee's trouble. Eventually, Lee is left alone, and he has no choice but to stow away his anger. His awakening soon stops, since there's no one to be angry at. He looks at the tray once more and sees the oil used to grill the hot dogs and some bits of hot dog still left in the tray. He looks closer at the small bits of hot dog that they had left in the tray, and he gets an idea. Eventually he reaches out and grabs it since that's all that's available. Can't afford to starve to death because he's the supreme heavenly demon. He puts it in his mouth, still with a frown on his face. But it seems he's come to terms with living with such lowly mortals. Meanwhile, the parts from the iron gangshis are still seen outside. Sunja proceeds to pick one of the robot's heads to inspect it more closely, in hopes that they'd be able to figure something out. Seryung just stands there and looks at the whole mess, wondering where to start from. Their ship is still in the sky in case they need to escape soon, and the entire place is littered with robot parts like a mechanic lab. Robert picks up one robot arm and notices the joints are too weak. He wonders why they're so poorly made and why the alloy is so weak. Sunja examines the head she's holding and tells him it's poorly made because it's not a finished product, and these are just prototypes. She looks closely at the head she's holding and scans it using the scanners in her eyes. Sunja scans it for a while and doesn't continue what she was saying. Seryung notices her rapt attention and asks her if she's trying to see something in the robot's head. Sunja responds affirmatively and says that the robot's neural networks are also quite simple, and tries to open up the head. After she opens the compartment, its intelligence chip is ejected, which Sunja refers to as a primitive M207 chip. She explains that the chip is at a level too embarrassing to be referred to as artificial intelligence. Sunja tells them that the M207 chip is optimized for receiving commands, so it lacks autonomous will, which is technically not artificial intelligence. Seryung follows her train of thoughts and asks if they were remotely controlled. To her surprise, Sunja replies with an affirmation and says that each individual unit was remotely controlled. The android quickly scans the perimeters and says that the total number of droids that attacked them was 9817 based on what she could detect. She reasons that this would mean that at least 9817 humans were controlling those droids. Meanwhile, see a lab filled with liquid-filled tubes. Each tube seems to be connected to a series of wires and contains something that cannot be clearly seen. Count Ritual and his other robots walk towards the lab to look at their experiments. He looks at the array of tubes with an evil and resolute look in his eyes, like every other evil character in the world. Taking a closer look, each tube is seen to contain naked people whose brains are connected to a series of wires, and it's clear this is where the robots are being controlled. One of the unconscious men, who is obviously one of the townspeople, is seen floating in the liquid, and he looks quite haggard. On the streets, Seryung asks Sunja what the total population of Manhwa district is, trying to figure out something. Sunja tells her that the exact number of people that live here is 98. Meanwhile, back in the Jaha Pavilion, Swirled Sovereign Yang is still seen burning all his internal energy with his soul. The folks realize that only one person is missing, which must be the Sword Sovereign. The Sword Sovereign remains unconscious, and the pink fire envelopes him as well as several plus blossom petals. Near the throne, Hua Rin sits down and stares at her father, with pain in her eyes. In another part of the world, Commander Zhang is shocked to hear what Cho has told him, and he politely asks him to repeat himself. While he wipes his mouth, Officer Cho repeats that he commands a state of immobility and lockdown for the entire District 32. He explains that no one must move, and no one must be allowed in. He also tells him to recall all dispatched personnel immediately. The commander is still shocked and asks why he has made this sudden decision. The officer just tells him these are precarious times and they require such measures. He continues by saying that 2,000 years of peace have been too long, and the prestige of the martial alliance formed by the Union of Major Sects has long faded. He asks the commander if he knows what happens when the fangs of the tiger that rules a mountain fall out, trying to describe their situation in a figure of speech. Commander Yang answers and tells him that the wolves will take over. Cho tells him that's wrong, but rather the wolves will try to become tigers themselves. Cho reminds him that wolves formed packs because of tigers. He adds that when the tiger is gone, they look around with eyes that saw the tiger, and fellow wolves start to seem weak instead, and this makes them want to attack them because they're much weaker than the tiger. He continues by saying that the first to become the target in such times is the strongest wolf because it's a tussle for power. Officer Cho quickly returns to his flight pod and walks with the commander, while other members of the sect bow to him. He continues his story by saying that the wolves will use the hunting habits they developed while in packs to band together and kill the strongest wolf amongst them. He makes his speech clear and says that their sect is the strongest wolf in the current martial world, and they have to act with extreme caution. The commander asks him if he's saying that the unidentified individual using their sect's martial art is related to what he just said. Cho confesses that he doesn't know, and that's the major issue. While he steps into his pod, he tells the commander that he received an emergency communication just before arriving in their district that an unknown individual headed toward Mount Hua. Commander Yang is shocked to hear him mention Mount Hua and asks to clarify if he's hearing correctly. The officer affirms it and tells him that an unknown element has been placed on a powder keg and is ready to explode. So they're just a single spark from an explosion in the martial world. Officer Cho explains that because of this, it's most important that they understand the current situation before taking any action at all. He gets into his pod and travels out of the sect, hoping to make sense of what is going on soon enough. The commander just watches him leave and doesn't know what to make of the whole thing. He frowns at the whole matter, and it seems like they're going to have to sit on their hands for now. Over at Mount Hua, Seryung and the gang go to the Jaha Pavilion to meet Hua Rin. Seryung asks Hua Rin to confirm what she had said about the people who had disappeared, always showing up at night. Hua Rin says that they do, except for her dad, who always stays behind regardless of their disappearance. She explains that he always stays behind in the fiery form and remains on this throne. Seryung looks at him blankly and doesn't know what to make of the entire situation. Sword Sovereign. Yang just sits on this throne in the midst of the fire and doesn't still notice their presence at all. Seryung asks Sunja how much time they have until sunset to know when the people will be appearing again. Sunja tells her that the Mount Hua planet switches between day and night every 6 hours. Based on her estimations, Sunja tells her they have 1 second till sunset. Suddenly, something happens in the next second that shocks the captain. Right in front of her, like clockwork, the Sword Sovereign gets up and hugs Hua Rin, holding her head like he did the last time. Hua Rin explains to them that he does these things, like stroking her head without any consciousness. She narrates that he even goes on to sip tea while surveying the premises, and later goes to read in the garden. She tells them that these were the exact things he did before she left for her last performance tour on her birthday, the year before, which means he's been on this cycle for a very long time now. She says that for some reason, he repeats this every day when the sun rises. Hua Rin, who still looks sad, tells them the others also do the same thing every single day. Over the comms, Robert tells the captain that something is wrong because none of the people seem to be showing up. He's seen sitting on a roof, and he informs her that the streets are still empty. Seryung gets worried and wonders why they're late today, so she asks Sunja if she detects anything. Sunja tells her she detects something else entirely. She looks at the captain and tells her that instead of the people appearing, she seems to be gradually fading. Seryung starts to fade from their view, and she's shocked when she hears those words. She looks at her hands and notices she's becoming translucent and wonders what's going on. Her hands completely disappear, and she starts to exclaim. Sunja tells them that the captain's vital signs seem to be disappearing. Suddenly, she fades right of their sight, and all that's left is a faint light. Meanwhile, Hua Rin remains in her father's embrace. Outside the atmosphere of the Mount Hua planet, a Greenwood ship is seen floating through space. Inside, Kim, the Galaxy Division leader, is seen looking over Mount Hua and its twin moons. Captain Chaiju enters inside and tries to call his attention to something. He explains that a teleportation was detected from the center of the Mount Hua planet a short while ago. The captain tells him that their analysis confirms that the moving identity is the blazing devil Seryung. Kim asks him what the destination of the teleportation is. The captain tells him that she was teleported to the second moon of the Mount Hua planet named Genta. Meanwhile, we go to the scenery on Genta, Mount Hua's second moon. Somewhere on the surface of the moon, there's a deep hole bored. Inside the deep dark hole, a scream of shock is heard. Inside the hole, the light that remained after Seryung disappeared suddenly appears. She continues to scream and shout that her body is disappearing, but she's nowhere to be seen. Her body starts to slowly materialize in the hole, and she keeps shouting and asking why her body is disappearing. Her body starts to form without her legs, and Seryung is freaked out and wonders if she has died and become a ghost. She starts to speak to an unknown being that she believes to be God, and begs him to bring her back to life because she still has so much to do. As she raises her hands in prayer, she notices that her hands have fully materialized, so she stops shouting and wonders what's going on. She's surprised that she has become visible and keeps asking what the heck is going on. Her gaze is suddenly drawn to the people in front of her, and she realizes she may not be in the afterlife. In front of her, Count Richel sits down on his sofa, with his android assistant by his side. Count Richel doesn't say anything, but he just watches her and waits for her to calm her nerves. Seryung looks right at him and wonders who he is. He doesn't say a word, but he just frowns as he looks at her with a sinister look in his eyes. A moment of silence is maintained in the eerie room, and neither of them say anything. Meanwhile, in the Greenwood ship, the captain tells Kim that the teleportation they observed seems to be a little unusual. He explains that there are no traces of consent from the moving entity during the teleportation process. The captain mentions that if this is the case, this could be an unauthorized forced transfer, which is unilateral teleportation, forbidden by galactic law. He suggests to the leader that this may be a serious issue, and it might be best to report the matter to those higher up. Kim doesn't turn back and just asks him if there's anyone higher than him, which is obviously a rhetorical question. The captain catches his drift, that he's asking him not to bypass his authority, so he just keeps quiet and doesn't speak. He soon blurts out that there isn't and bows quickly, declaring the Black Tiger as his sole commanding authority. Kim commends his attitude and tells him to keep monitoring the situation of things for now. He also mentions that they can't say anything just yet because the use of forbidden technologies by the galactic law on the moon could imply significant backing from a higher authority. He tells the captain not to intervene recklessly and ensure he investigates thoroughly before they can take any action, because they need to assess whether knowing about all this brings them more harm or benefit. The captain just responds with a loud affirmation to his boss's commands. Kim keeps staring at the twin moons and privately wonders what can be made of the whole thing. Soon after, some intelligence reaches the West Heaven Sword Matron, and she asks again to clarify that she heard it correctly. It appears that Elena had just told her about the man she met in Mount Hua, and she asks her to repeat herself. Elena, who is on her knees, explains that the man she met claimed to be her father. She clarifies what she said and says that the man told her he was the one who fathered her. She continues her story and talks about how she lost against him in a duel. Hearing that surprises the Sword Matron because of how hard it is for any martial artist to beat Elena. She thinks about Mount Hua and considers that the person who defeated her daughter and who claimed to be her father is now at Mount Hua. Meanwhile, on Mount Hua, Robert slams his hand on the table to make a point. He screams out that they have to save the captain, and he's overreacting a bit like he always does. He angrily curses that some bastard had the guts to kidnap their captain, and Lee just listens to him quietly. When he starts to curse some more, Lee doesn't understand any of the words he's saying, so he asks Sunja what Robert is talking about. Sunja tells him she wouldn't like to translate any of it because it's majorly cursing, so she focuses on her work. Hwarin says that the place where Seryung was kidnapped might have something to do with the incident on this planet. She guesses that it might be that the other people were taken away in the same way. She tells them it's possible, but they just don't have any proof. Sunja interrupts and tells her they actually have evidence. She explains that the phenomenon when the people from the Mount Hua planet disappeared is the same. It's called a forced teleportation, which takes a person without his/her consent. She adds that such unilateral teleportation is forbidden by the galactic law. Robert shouts again that this means that everyone is trapped somewhere. He tells them they can't sit idly and they need to go rescue them, and he grabs Lee by his shirt this time. Lee turns to Sunja and asks her what's wrong with Robert, but she just walks away and ignores them. She tells Lee that it seems that Robert has post-traumatic stress disorder from his time in the military, so this means that he struggles to control his anger when he gets stressed. Meanwhile, Robert continues to use the F word and cuss in Lee's face, still grabbing him by his shirt. Lee looks at him and tells him to let go of his shirt. Sunja tells him it's no use because once he starts, he doesn't listen to anyone. Our guy starts to awaken, and he speaks to him in his martial form, which catches Sunja's attention, because that might just work. Robert promptly apologizes and lets go off Lee. Sunja just stares at them blankly, and reasons that Robert could compete in an anger management contest. They return to the matter at hand, and Sunja tells them that there are limits to how far the captain could have been moved if she was subjected to unilateral teleportation. She says it's technically impossible for them to teleport her long range, so they can rule out the idea that they've taken her to another planet. This leaves them with three options. The captain is either still on the Mount Hua planet or on either of the two moons. Lee joins her by the window and looks at the moons. He asks her if she can pinpoint which of them the captain is on. The android tells him that she has scanned the Mount Hua planet, and it has no life signs except for the Sword Sovereign, so it can be ruled out of the options. Apparently they're only left with the two moons named Genta and Sycharis. She continues that there are life signs on both the moons. It's hard to pin down where the signs are coming from since both moons are so close to each other. Lee glances at her and asks if they have to take a random guess to proceed. Sunja agrees and thinks for a while. She remembers that the captain is obsessed with gold. Since the captain is obsessed with gold, she decides to choose the golden one, Sycharis. Meanwhile, she's as wrong can get. We head to the second moon of the Mount Hua planet Genta. On Genta, Count Richel still stares at Seryung, who had just been teleported into the facility and still doesn't say a word. Seryung asks him who he is, but he remains silent and doesn't answer her. Richel's personal android scans Seryung and detects that she has an externally mounted 1.4 giga internal energy drive. It also detects that she has a 3.3 giga ultra-high density, high-capacity internal energy drive embedded in her body. The android continues by telling the Count that the only external weapon that Seryung has is the electronic soft sword attached to her waist. Count Richel finally speaks and talks about her 3.3 giga internal energy drive while he enjoys some sparkling water. He remarks that a backwater bounty hunter is carrying around something she can't even use. Seryung asks him who he is again and asks him if he's deaf. In another part of the universe, a bright ray of light shines on a seedling. The seedling seems to be planted in something that looks like sand, and it survives due to the direct sunlight it's getting. A very old man crouches next to it and watches it bud, enjoying the beauties of life. Nearby, Officer Cho approaches the old man and refers to him as Master. Cho comes in with a solemn look on his face and declares that there's an issue he would like to discuss. The old man immediately tells him that he knows about the issue related to the events at Mount Hua, and mentions that he knows he's been tasked with resolving it. Master tells him not to act impulsively, but to rather wait until the bud fully blooms. He says that only then will he be able to tell what type of tree it is, whether it's a poplar or a willow tree. He says that they must wait until the entities backing Count Richel are completely exposed, and that's when they can strike decisively. The Master reminds him that he raised him to understand that much, so he asks him if he's not mature enough or if there is another problem. Cho doesn't say anything and just remains silent. The Master senses that there's another issue on his mind and asks him what it is and what could have brought out his childishness. Cho explains that a mysterious person appeared during his investigation into the matter. He says that the person performed their martial arts and reached the level of reversing the energy flow. He also says that this person knows their sect's secret technique called the Demon Heart Sura Sword Technique. As he speaks, the Master suddenly looks horrified, so Cho hesitates to say the last part. He finally speaks up and says this individual has reached the pinnacle of mastery. Officer Cho explains that the problem is that this person is not affiliated with their sect. The Master, who now looks grim, blankly tells him to kill this person. Suddenly, the seedling behind them withers and dies, and it seems to have been from the master's influence. Cho asks him to repeat himself because it seems he didn't hear him. The master suddenly becomes red and exclaims that it's an anomaly and a monster, so he tells him to find him and kill him without fail. It seems to be that the masters of the heavenly demon sect are trying to cover up something. It doesn't make sense to Cho, but he just looks surprised and doesn't say a word. Later, Cho returns to his traveling pod and proceeds to continue his assignment. The pod flies through space while he sits on it. Soon, he's received into the pod, and his journey begins. Meanwhile, on the Genta moon, Seryung asks Count Richel who he is again and asks if he can't hear her. Richel doesn't give her a response and simply orders his android to check her and continues his drinking. The android disappears from behind him, but that's because she moves lightning fast. Suddenly, she appears behind Seryung, who is still looking the other way, unaware of what is behind her. She detects the android and turns back, preparing an energy blast in her hands, and she asks it what it thinks it's doing. As she released the blast of energy, the android seems to have disappeared out of sight again. This time it appears behind her and grabs the back of her neck. This android has got skills. Seryung is alerted to the hand that's covering her face. She wonders how the heck the android is moving so fast since she's never seen anything like it. Richel simply tells her to accept it and says resistance is futile. He tells her that from now on, he will ask her a few questions. He tells her to answer them properly, and he will grant her a life free of eternal suffering. Seryung, who has had enough of his crap, tells him to shut up, and she pushes back the android. The Count is suddenly alerted by her movement and wonders if she can use the adaptive variation of martial arts. Seryung grabs the electronic soft sword in her waist and proceeds to use it to slice through the machine. She swirls the sword around her to create a tornado of cuts around her, but the android quickly retreats. It avoids each of the hits because of its ability to see and move quickly. Eventually, it finds an opening and advances to lay a hand on the captain. It finally gets closer and almost touches Seryung, who spots her and aims the sword at her. The android avoids all the cuts and tries to grab her arm to subdue her. Count Richel tells Seryung that her fighting is useless because the machine contains data on all martial arts in the world. Seryung keeps trying to cut the android, but it manages to move past her hit every time. She realizes that it must be true that this robot has information on every martial art in the world. She notices how easily the machine is able to read her movements. Seryung is a tough nut to crack, so she continues to fight, and she tells the Count not to make her laugh. She launches forward for a direct frontal attack at the android, but it quickly moves to her side and it avoids the sword. Suddenly, the captain feels a strike on her back as the android finds an opening to hit her. It lifts her off the ground and throws her headlong across the room. Seryung lands on her face and is unable to stop her fall due to the sudden impact of the hit. The android maintains its position and waits for her to react, so it can know how to handle her. Seryung quickly gets back up and wields her sword again. She takes a stance and waves the sword to show she's ready for some action. Count Richel just continues sipping his sparkling water, and he's surprised to see her get up so quickly. The android keeps watching Seryung and prepares to give her another load of trouble. Seryung also maintains her stance and waits for the robot to make a move. She starts to sweat as the fight has become more intense than she expected. She reasons that it seems that her usual martial art isn't going to work and she has to think up something new. While she's thinking, the robot fades away again in the speed of light. It appears behind her while Seryung is still looking the other way, but she quickly detects that it's behind her. As the android reaches out to grab her from behind, the captain doesn't move a muscle and pretends not to know it's there. As it swings its arm to grab her, Seryung suddenly disappears out of sight and gives the robot a taste of its own medicine. She leaps high up out of the robot's sight, and it looks around for a little bit, unsure of where she went. As she swirls in the air, she prepares her sword to land a hit as she heads back down. The android quickly realizes her position and leaps off the ground to take the fight to her. Seryung uses a martial attack called Bullet and throws the sword directly downwards like a bullet, hoping to impale the android to the ground. The soft sword straightens out and heads downward with a strong and deadly force. The sword heads right for the robot's face, and it seems like Seryung's plan is going to work after all. Unfortunately, the robot quickly blocks the sword with her hands and redirects it towards the ground. It all happens so fast, and the robot continues upward to catch Seryung, who is still in midair. The robot inches in and almost grabs the captain, who is now falling back to the ground. Because the sword is an adaptive one, it wraps around the android's arm, and it seems this was all part of Seryung's plan. The robot creates a heat wave in its arms and plans to deal great damage to Seryung's stomach area, but the captain just helplessly remains in midair since she's thrown away her weapon. The sword twists around the robot's arm and redirects itself back up, which is pretty cool. The soft sword propels itself right back up and aims itself towards the nasty android. Soon after, it pierces through the android's head and destroys it, and it seems like it didn't expect this to happen at all. The light on its head goes out as it appears that the sword has destroyed its intelligence unit. All this happens in a split second while they're both in midair and continue to fall to the ground. The Count angrily smashes his cup when he sees that Seryung has destroyed his precious android. He opens his mouth in surprise, and he recognizes the move Seryung just used as the Dark Heaven Blood Dragon dagger from the Sichuan Tang clan. The android falls headlong once its intelligence unit is destroyed, and Count Richel stares in shock. Seryung also falls to the ground right next to it. She quickly gets up and holds her stomach due to the impact of the fall and the heat the robot hit her with. This time, it's Richel who asks her who she is. Seryung just angrily frowns at him and doesn't say a word. It appears that she's also bleeding from her mouth. The Count, who is still shocked, tells her that the Sichuan Tang clan was exterminated 10 years ago without trace, and asks her how she knows their martial arts. Seryung doesn't answer him but just tells him she'll have to use higher measures since it has come to this. She suddenly activates the 3.3 giga energy drive that's embedded in her body, which Richel said is too complex for her to use, and she reasons that desperate times call for desperate measures. The drive is called the Xuanwu Divine Art Drive, with a Qi Internal Operation System, QIOS. She activates the drive to its maximum. This shocks Richel the more because he knows that the Xuanwu Divine Art is an exclusive secret technique passed only to the head of the Tang clan, and this seems to be getting more and more interesting. Seryung, who is now using the other integral drive at its max rate, leaps up from the ground in great force and tells him to shut up. Count Richel just stands where he is and watches her in midair. He tells himself that it seems like she plans to dominate the sky to attack him from all directions. In a bright green light, Seryung lifts herself off the ground. A sudden explosion occurs, which releases thousands of green and white arrows that look like an exploding firecracker. Richel just continues to stare in surprise once he realizes that this method is the infine rain blossom technique. The arrows are all launched towards him at the same time, and he doesn't seem to be getting out of the way. Nearby, you can see a massive explosion in the facility from all the power that Seryung released. We head back to the ship of the West Heaven Sword Matron. Inside the ship, Elena continues by telling her mother that the circumstances of meeting the mysterious man she's talking about were also strange. She tells her that she had arrived at Manhwa to receive a bounty request. She remembers that when she got there, she suddenly lost consciousness, and she suddenly woke up in front of him. Like he always does, Count Richel just sits on his couch and watches her in silence with a sour look on his face. Elena recounts the incident and says she doesn't still understand why she had to meet him that way. She remembers just staring at him and him doing the same thing for a short period, with neither of them saying a word. Her words catch the sword matron's attention, and she realizes that what Elena is describing is unilateral teleportation. In the flashback, Count Richel tells Elena there's no need to be surprised. He tells her that he called her here to grant her her wish. Elena looks at him in surprise, unsure of what he's talking about. He asks her if she doesn't want to become stronger and to see the world beneath her feet. He tells her this dream is the reason why, after earning the infamous title of 8-foot fighting ghost, she even turned her spaceship into a dueling arena in pursuit of nothing but battles. He explains that the closer she got, the more distant the path became, leading her into despair and crying every night in hopelessness. He tells her he has called her to give her strength, the strength to look down upon the world. Elena admits that the man seemed to know a lot about her. In the flashback, she asks him who he is and what the heck he's talking about. She mentions that his accuracy of knowledge was infuriatingly unpleasant. Richel simply gets up and tells her it seems she'd only understand if they have a fight. In the present, Elena tells her mother that they decided to fight. There was only one issue. Meanwhile, Count Richel seems to have overpowered Seryung despite her grand appearance, and he holds her by the throat. Elena tells her mother that no matter what she did, it was useless against him. In the present, Count Richel holds Seryung by the throat. His clothes seem to have been burnt away by Seryung's green fire, but his entire body seems to be made of metal, just like the androids. Seryung chokes from the pressure of his hand and starts to bleed from her mouth. In the same manner, Count Richel had held Elena by her throat after defeating her. In the flashback, he tells her that he will make her strong, just like he is. He tells her he's going to do this because she's his daughter, but Elena looks quite skeptical by that assertion. In the present, Count Richel orders the weakened Seryung to answer his question. He promises to make her weak body strong if she answers him. He mentions that the only cost is that she'd have to abandon her useless mind. In the present day, the sword matron is sincerely shocked as she hears Elena's story. Elena tells her that he gave her something. Suddenly, her body starts to shine in a bright blue light, which shocks the sword matron. Elena tells her that he was the one that gave her this newfound power that she has. The sword matron just stares at her daughter in shock and realizes that the power he gave her is called steel fortification. Meanwhile, Sunja continues her research to detect where the captain is as they prepare for takeoff. Robert starts shouting again and asks her why they aren't leaving, and he asks her to hurry up and move the ship. Sunja looks at the radar once more and notices that something has suddenly appeared on the scanner. On the scanner, a red dot shows that someone is approaching them and is nearby. Sunja stops their journey to the Cicerus moon upon noticing the new ship. Right in front of them, a pod that looks like it belongs to a member of the Heavenly Demon sect shows up. Both aircraft stop in midair, and neither of them steps out or tries to make contact. In the S-Devil ship, Robert asks Sunja what the heck is in front of them, and asks her to tell them to move so he doesn't crush them. Sunja tells him she can't do that, and he asks her why. She says the ship is a Celestial-class battleship even though it looks small, and their ship can't even match it. She adds that the worst part is that it belongs to the Heavenly Demon sect. Robert is shocked to hear that, as he wonders what the Heavenly Demon sect wants with them. Moments later, Officer Cho teleports into their aircraft, shocking Robert and Sunja. He looks towards where Lee is sitting and completely ignores the other bounty hunters. Lee doesn't even notice him because he's busy trying to use a knife and a fork on a single piece of hot dog. Poor guy. He should have just used his hands. Cho stares right at him, although you can barely call it a stare since he has such small eyes. He immediately recognizes Lee as the person he saw on the screen at the district. Robert approaches the officer and politely asks him what brings someone from the Heavenly Demon sect to their ship. Cho doesn't turn back to answer him, but continues towards the place Lee is sitting. He tells our guy that he's the first-class officer of the Disaster Safety Headquarters Central Committee of the Heavenly Demon sect, and proceeds to have his seat. He tells Lee to feel free to speak comfortably with him, but Lee just continues eating and doesn't say a word. Robert is surprised by the whole thing, and wonders how a little kid can be a first-class officer, which is an extremely high-ranking office in the Heavenly Demon sect. Officer Cho cheerfully tells Lee that he has a pressing request, and he's come to see him to talk about it. The officer asks Robert to stay out of this matter and continues his talk with Lee. Cho tells him that the mastermind behind this incident is someone named Richel Archimond. He explains that he was once a top scientist and directed the development of military weapons for a defense contractor under the human government. It was a project called the Steel City. This explains the Iron Gangshi that had attacked them while they were on Mount Hua. The officer tells them that due to Richel's inhuman development process, he was expelled and then disappeared. He adds that Richel is now hiding here and is conducting experiments on a much larger scale. While he's talking, Lee doesn't even look at him and continues to eat his hot dog. Cho continues by saying that, in other words, Richel wasn't just expelled like they were told, but he's been receiving more funding to continue his projects in secret. Officer Cho tells him that they suspect that his supporters are some factions within the human government's military. When Lee finishes the hot dog, he asks Sunja for some water and completely ignores all that he heard. Officer Cho stares at him, surprised that he doesn't give any response even after hearing all the information he just gave. He wonders who the heck Lee even is. Robert asks him if he just mentioned the military faction and asks if he's saying that this is the work of the human government's military. Cho affirms that and tells him to stay out of this because this is beyond what civilians can handle. Meanwhile, Sunja gives our guy some water, and he still doesn't say a word. Robert asks Cho about their captain, and tells him that their captain was just kidnapped. He tells him that there's nothing they can do about it, and says all they can do is pray for her. Robert becomes triggered again, and he smashes his hands on the table. He asks Cho what sort of nonsense that is and tells him to shut up and get out of here because they're going to rescue their captain. He tells him he doesn't care who he is, and they won't let it slide if he tries to stop them. Lee finally speaks for the first time and tells Cho to listen to him. He tells him that he's not trying to intervene, but he's not going to do what he tells them to do about the matter either. Lee tells him that he keeps thinking about it, and he wonders why he would give such valuable information to them in detail. Our guy says that would only be because he wants to use them as tools to get out of the responsibility of dealing with the issue. Lee hisses and says a kid who barely has even a single hair on his head is trying to manipulate him. Cho just replies by asking him who he is, and refers to him as Noble One. Lee doesn't answer but asks him if that's the real reason that he came here. The officer doesn't answer either but just remains quiet. Lee suddenly leaves the table and tells him that if that's not the reason he came, then they both have nothing to do with each other, and they never will. Cho finally addresses the elephant in the room and asks him if he has any connection with the Heavenly Demon sect. Lee blankly replies that he has no connection with them. The officer tells him that he'll believe him for now, but he asks him once again if he's saying that he has no connection whatsoever with the Heavenly Demon sect, just to confirm. Cho tells him that if this is so, his actions from now on have nothing to do with their sect, and their sect will make that claim. Lee doesn't even turn around and tells him that's fine. So he asks him to leave because he's busy. Shortly after, Cho gets right back into his ship and goes on his merry way. Lee watches him leave, and he seems to be interested in the officer, even though he was very harsh. He keeps watching, and he thinks to himself that it's a relief that there are still talents in the Heavenly Demon sect. Meanwhile, Cho continues his journey through space to figure out what's going on. Lee thinks to himself that Cho seems to have some talent, but he's still too immature. They return back to the business of saving the captain, and Robert says it's time to go and deal with the matter properly. Sunja agrees with him, but tells him that the coordinates have changed. She tells him that instead of the moon Sycharis that they designated before, it's changed to the moon Genta now. It seems that Cho has something to do with communicating the new coordinates to them. Meanwhile, we resume back at the second moon of the Manhwa planet, Genta. On the planet's surface, there's a deep hole that Richel bore through it to create his facility. Inside the facility, we find Seryung, who is now weak, lying on the ground after she was defeated. Count Richel drags her inside towards his private laboratory. Inside the laboratory, there's something that looks like a large operating table. Richel drags her to the entrance of the lab, where there's a sort of operating table with cuffs to secure people to the table. He drags Seryung into the room and proceeds to strap her to the table. Seryung asks him what he's trying to do, and he looks back at her. He asks her if she's finally awake, but she only frowns at him. He tells her that he can't believe that she's already woken up, and he mentions that it seems there's something special about the noble bloodlines, referring to her as the Lady of the Sinchuan Tang clan. Seryung asks him where they are and asks him what he's planning to do to her. Richel tells her not to worry because he intends to free her from pain. He adds that he will erase her memories and even the darkest parts of her past. It seems that he plans to add her to his collection of people that he stored in the tubes. He tells her that he'll turn her into an iron gangshi, which gives her a simple and useful life where she'll know nothing but obedience. Upon hearing this, Seryung groans as she closes her palm in an attempt to generate an energy blast, but nothing happens. Richel tells her that it's no use because he's blocked all the meridians in her body and has paralyzed her nervous system. He prepares the table by opening the cuffs and tells her that her body will no longer listen to her anymore because he's paralyzed her brain and spinal cord, which are responsible for processing and integrating information. Seryung tries much harder to move her body, but it doesn't seem to be working. He tells her it's no use, so there's no need to stress herself. Suddenly, something shocking happens. Seryung suddenly gets up, even though he had blocked her central nervous system. She tells him not to dream foolish dreams and adds that he can kill people of the Sichuan Tang clan, but you can't dominate them. She activates a strange martial art technique that causes her eyes to become red and leaks out blood from her eyes and mouth. Before he can respond, Richel feels her hands on his chest, and he senses a strange scent. Around her palm, a bright yellow substance comes out that burns his steel body and allows her to slowly push her hands through him. He suddenly realizes it's some form of poison. Count Richel just stands there while she pushes her hands deeper through his chest. She tells him that it's called pigeon blood poison, and explains that people born in the Tang clan receive a grain of deadly poison in their hearts as a gift. She tells him that it's meant to be used when they die. As she speaks, her eyes continue to fill up with and ooze out blood. The impact of the poison starts to affect the Count, and he tries to remove Seryung's arm. She tells him it's useless to try to move her because the more her heart burns, the stronger the poison becomes, even to the point where it can melt even metal. True to her word, the poison starts to create a larger gape in Richel's chest. She calls him an ugly monster and tells him she'd like to tell him something. He watches in terror, wondering what she wants to say. She continues to smile, with her entire face leaking out blood, and asks him to die with her. Suddenly, a sharp object comes between the two of them and slices through Seryung's hand. It turns out to be Richel's destroyed android. That doesn't seem to be so destroyed after all. Richel pulls her hand and attempts to sever it from the rest of her body. Seryung, who is now almost dead, looks down and notices the android, realizing it has foiled her plans of killing Richel. A stream of blood issues out from Seryung's amputated hand, and it spills everywhere. A warning alarm is suddenly triggered in the facility, and it looks like there's trouble. Richel quickly looks up in annoyance and wonders what could have triggered the warning alarm. The system continuously declares that intruders have been detected in the environment, and the alarm keeps blaring. Meanwhile, Lee equips himself with a space shield, and he's not looking happy at all. Robert also puts on his combat suit, and he stands behind Lee, who has his hands in his pocket, as usual. Suddenly, an army of iron gangshi erupts out of the hole and prepares themselves for battle against the S-Devils. They rush towards them with swords in their thousands, while a couple more jump out of the facility to join them. Robert prepares his weapons and tells Lee that he'll take care of the robots, so he tells him to save the captain. Lee doesn't waste a second, and he leaps from the spot and leaves Robert to handle the androids like he had said. He leaps into the sky past the army of incoming bots and heads right for the underground facility. Robert is surprised that he didn't even wait and he left so quickly. Lee flies right into the hole that leads to the underground facility and comes face to face with the robots who are coming in as reinforcements. Suddenly, Lee awakens his form and a bright light appears from where he is. Our hero triggers a large explosion as he makes his way through the hole, and it destroys all the robots that are still coming out and even wrecks the hole. Robert keeps looking in amazement. In front of him, several rocks are launched out by the explosion, and it lands on several of the bots, killing them instantly. Nonetheless, there are many more left to fight. Robert mentions that Lee could have at least helped out a little before he left, because he didn't have to take his words so literally. A large army of Iron Gangshi run towards Robert, wielding their swords and ready to fight. He starts to curse when he realizes he's in this alone, so she starts firing all his weapons at the bots. Meanwhile, Count Richel watches the situation on the surface on a screen, but he looks badly injured. On the screen he can see Robert going all in and shooting at the Iron Gangshis. Robert goes in guns blazing and is hell-bent on taking them all down. Richel's android scans each of Robert's weapons and lists them out. It detects the MZCT-106 recoilless laser Kanat. It also detects the TTR-8 automatic laser multi-missile. Meanwhile, Robert shoots those missiles and wreaks great havoc on the Gangshis. Some of the Gangshis close in on him, and he flies off the ground. He uses something that the android calls anti-gravity rockets. The androids tell Richel that all these weapons are definitely special equipment for the special forces. It, however, adds that the equipments are outdated and not currently in use. Richel realizes that he's not an active soldier but a retired one, and he decides he was worried for no reason. He orders the android to get rid of Robert and the rest of them as well. Suddenly, another alarm goes off again which alerts Rochelle and the android. He glances at the android and wonders why another alarm has suddenly gone off. It tells him that an intruder has entered District 8. Seconds later, she tells him that the intruder has passed District 8 and is now entering District 7. Robert becomes alarmed, and he wonders how the intruder could bypass their security measures so quickly. Moments later, the android tells him that the intruder has passed from District 8 to District 7, then to District 6, then to District 5. It continues listing that the intruder has gone from 4 to 3 to 2, and suddenly stops when it is unable to analyze the intruder's entry location data. Richel is honestly shocked, and he retorts that it's impossible that someone had bypassed all their security so quickly. The android tries to reanalyze the data to detect the intruder's location. Suddenly, a bright, fiery light appears behind the android. It tries to say the current location of the intruder, but it freezes. Immediately, the android explodes on the spot, as it seems the so-called intruder got to her. Richel watches as the android explodes into bits of steel that scatter around the room, and he tries to spot where the attack came from. Meanwhile, the triggered alarm starts to affect the people who are trapped in the facility, and their tubes start to fill up with gas. The entire tube almost fills up with gas, as it seems like it's a response to the emergency. Suddenly, the alarms stop blaring and the tubes return back to normal. All the tubes return to normal, and they return to normal oxygenation. The entire room fills up with smoke from the explosion, and Richel stands there surprised, still trying to figure out who the intruder is. He notices a large gape in the wall where it seems that someone has broken through it. Through the opening, Richel spots Lee, who walks into the facility with his hands still in his pockets. He realizes that he is the intruder that broke through all the facility's defenses and just stares at him. Lee stares back at him with a curious look on his face, and he looks completely harmless. Shortly after, our guy steps through the opening and walks towards the Count. Lee just looks at him and doesn't say a word. Richel also stares in shock, still wondering who the heck he is, or how he was able to get past all through all those bots and get here. While the Count still fixes his gaze on him, Lee moves faster than light and appears behind him. He walks toward Seryung, who is now on the table, and Count Rochelle turns back to look at him. Seryung is strapped to the table with one arm because her other arm has been cut off, and she is stained all over with blood. Count Richel finally breaks the silence, and he loudly demands to know who he is. Lee doesn't pay him any attention, but continues looking at Seryung's blood-stained face and body. He finally speaks and tells the Count that he has ruined a child who's just entered into her youth. He adds that on top of that, he's not treating people with respect either, referring to the thousands of people he trapped in the tubes. Lee looks right at him and tells him that he's nothing but a monster. The Count looks surprised and just keeps staring at him, unsure of how to react since he doesn't know who he is. Lee frowns at him, and his gaze shocks the Count, who is still shocked by his sudden emergence. He rudely asks Lee who he is one more time and asks him what he's up to. Lee just reaches out his hands towards him and activates one of his martial arts skills. Seryung's soft sword that was on the ground suddenly begins to respond to Lee, and it hits against the ground. The sword lifts itself from the ground and starts to make its way forward. Our guy tells Count Richel that he refuses to talk to anything that is non-human and continues to summon the sword. The sword leaps right off the ground and heads towards Richel and Lee. Instead of piercing through Richel's head, Lee draws the sword right past his ear, probably to show him what he's capable of doing. The sword moves towards Lee, and he catches it. The Count is shocked to see him use such a martial art technique and recognizes it as a technique known as void manipulation. He quickly scans Lee, but he realizes that he's not fitted with any internal drive. This realization disturbs him more, and he becomes worried that his opponent doesn't have an internal drive installed. He wonders how he's able to use a skill like void manipulation, which can only be performed by those who have reached the transcendent level. He continues the scan with a scanner that is equipped into his eyes. He's dumbfounded, and wonders if Lee is using ancient martial arts. Richel stands his ground, but he realizes he's in a bad spot, and wonders why this new opponent has to come at him at such an important time. The Count looks down at his malfunctioning body from when Seryong had wounded him, and he starts to wish he hadn't been hurt by a crazy woman. Lee moves closer towards him and keeps on staring at him. He stretches the shoulder towards Richel's neck, and the Count looks surprised. Lee tells him that he's not only non-human, but he's not even a martial warrior. Our hero asks him how he can even think about useless things during a fight. All his talk gets to Richel, who angrily tells him to shut up and rushes towards him to attack. The Count runs towards him and proceeds to land a deadening blow. Suddenly, Richel notices blood spilling out from his hands. Apparently, Lee had moved right past him and had cut off his left arm. Richel looks backward and spots his strong arm on the ground. Lee tells him that he cut him up to repay him for what he did to Seryong. Meanwhile, Seryong lays unconscious on the operating table. Lee continues by telling Richel that the only thing left is for him to pay the price of pissing him off. He starts to awaken his form, and he tells the Count to brace himself because the price of pissing him off can be quite expensive. Our guy starts to release a great deal of energy into the lab, and it looks like the Count is in big trouble. Count Richel thinks to himself that he must be quite unlucky. Not only does he have to deal with the woman from the Sichuan Tang clan, but he has to face this guy too on the same day. He notices that his internal drive is operating below 40% due to the injury that Seryong had caused in his chest, so there's practically no chance that he can win this fight. He decides to use a desperate measure in such a desperate time. He activates his internal drive but sets its operation rate to the max. His internal drive system starts to give a danger alarm because it seems like it's impossible for his body to handle so much energy after being damaged. The system alerts him that he's surpassing operational limits, and it's unable to control the heat output. The system continues to remind Richel that he's in danger, but he continues running the internal drive at its max. Lee notices him running his internal energy to its max and wonders how strange a skill that is. He wonders how the world ended up like this, where people start using skills that are far beyond their capability, and remembers the good old days of proper martial arts. Suddenly, he hears a nearby voice telling him to kill Richel. He looks beside him to know where the voice is coming from. It turns out to be Seryong, who has regained her consciousness, but doesn't seem to be in good shape at all. She tells him that Richel is trying to activate a self-destruction sequence, so she tells him to kill him before he does that. Lee quickly looks towards the Count, but it looks like it's too late. Meanwhile, the Count is releasing light from every hole in his body, and he looks like he's about to explode into bits. Lee realizes it's too late, and he watches Richel take his own life right in front of him. And bright light issues from where the Count is standing, and it looks like an explosion is about to be triggered. The light grows brighter and continues to envelope the entirety of the facility. Meanwhile, Robert's weapons begin to fail because he's exhausted all his ammo. His TTR-8 missiles become depleted, and the system asks him to reload his ammo. His photon cannon energy also becomes depleted, and the system asks him to reload that too. His V-10 Laster Claymore begins to malfunction, and the system tells him that inspection and repair are needed. His fireproof suit also begins to malfunction, and a new item replacement is required. The terrible part is that he is still surrounded by hundreds of bots who are still ready for action. It doesn't look like a good position to be in. Robert mutters that he had told Lee just this, and it would have been easy for him to take care of them perfectly if only he had stayed back to help him a little bit earlier. The Gangshis don't seem to care about all that, and they slowly walk towards him when they notice he has stopped firing at them. Robert loudly tells them to stop and says they should all take a break for a minute, calling them scrap metal bastards. He suddenly asks them if they know who he is and proceeds to take off his combat suit. He drops the frontal armor of the combat suit, and it looks like he's about to ditch it. He totally ditches the suit and goes bare, declaring that he's Robert Carlyle, the Sergeant Major of the Special Tactical Unit from the Northern Galaxy Combat Forces. He brings out 2 daggers and tells the Gangshis not to get too scared. Robert jumps right at them and tells them all to bring it on. This doesn't look good at all. The bots are surprised to see him leap at them, but they look like they're ready to fight fire with fire. Suddenly, Robert notices a large explosion right in front of his eyes, and he's surprised as to what is happening. In front of him, he notices a very large explosion that seems to be coming from the underground facility. The explosion grows larger and covers a large part of the moon's surface. It's a pretty large and blinding explosion that blurs everything out for a moment. Robert spots the explosion from where he is but still wonders what's going on. He opens his mouth in surprise as he keeps looking around. He just stands there with his weapon in hand, still shocked about the sudden turn of events. The explosion looks like a large mushroom, and it looks like a nuke had hit the site. The explosion is so great that it can be seen from miles away, with several materials being thrown into space. In space, the explosion is also noticed from the Greenwood ship. Kim, who had been secretly monitoring the activities of the S-Devil bounty hunters, is also shocked to witness such a sudden explosion. Captain Cheju comes to tell him that they have detected an electromagnetic field explosion of gigaton scale from Mount Hua's planet Moon. Kim tells him that this is getting more serious than they had expected. He mentions that an electromagnetic field explosion of this magnitude can only be caused by military personnel, and this hints to the fact that the human government may have a hand in the matter. He orders the captain to delete all the records they have of this incident, including the video footage. He tells the captain that they saw nothing here. The captain is shocked by his leader's commands, since he had earlier suggested that the current situation be reported to higher authority. Meanwhile, Officer Cho's celestial battleship also happens to be nearby. From his ship, he also detects the mega explosion that's occurring on Mount Hua's moon. He watches it from a screen on his ship and wonders what could have happened. On Genta, Robert still stands perplexed since he doesn't still know what's going on. He finally asks himself what's happening, as not only an explosion was triggered, but all the bots seem to have been deactivated. This is because they can no longer receive commands from the base. He suddenly remembers that they're here to save the captain, and he wonders if she's safe since she was in the facility. He abandons the site and frantically runs towards the facility, asking himself where the captain could be. Suddenly, another bright light emerges, which stops him in his tracks. Hopefully the facility isn't exploding the second time. He sees a bright light in the sky and looks closer to see what it is. The light grows brighter, and it seems to be advancing towards him. Lee suddenly emerges from the light on the operation board, with Captain Se-ryung in his arms. Taking a closer look, Robert sees that the captain is wounded and has lost an arm. Lee looks down at her wounded body, and he looks very sad. Robert just stands there shocked. He looks at Lee and the wounded captain and just keeps quiet, hopeful that the captain will survive this. Meanwhile, Officer Cho returns to his master and reports that the Mount Hua planet has returned to normal. Meanwhile, the master spends his time looking at another growing plant in a field full of flowers. Cho tells him that the people who were used as test subjects of the experiment have also returned to their daily lives. He says that fortunately they don't remember anything, and it's as if it never happened. The master tells him that the whole thing really feels like a strange ghost story, and he asks him how Ritual could manage to pull this off. Officer Cho tells him that the only possible explanation is that they've managed to commercialize entropy inversion. The master doesn't know what entropy inversion is and tells him to speak in a way that he can understand, since not everyone is a genius like him. Cho explains that entropy inversion is a technology that reconfigures time itself, for example, like resetting time. Due to the risk of creating multiple universes, experiments concerning it have been banned. He continues by saying that, however, Ritual did not only complete the technology, he was able to invert all the subjects used in the experiment at once. Moreover, he has also managed to create forbidden technologies that are unknown, such as unilateral teleportation, among others. He says that Rochelle is a genius greater than his reputation. The master tells him that with such great abilities, it's clear that the military factions of the human government must be willing to support him. He calls them greedy humans and says they probably don't know that playing with fire can burn them, and even the world. The master asks him if Ritual is dead. Cho tells him that he's not entirely sure. The master concludes that this means that Ritual is still alive if he's not sure. Cho affirms his suspicions. He receives orders to ensure he gets rid of Ritual properly. The master also reminds him to get rid of that person who's using their sect's martial arts, referring to Lee. Officer Cho doesn't object, but only tells him that he understands. He doesn't look comfortable with the idea since it doesn't seem to make sense, but he just remains silent. Later, the officer returns to his ship and sits on it as usual. He remains on it for a while, and he seems to be in deep thought. Meanwhile, things on the Mount Hua planet seem to have returned to normal. Sovereign Yang treats Lee to a cup of tea and tells him that his daughter has told him all that happened. He tells Lee that he doesn't know how to thank him for saving his daughter and those who acted as rebels. Lee just tells him they didn't act rebelliously, but they were controlled as puppets by someone else. Lee tells him that there are more evildoers behind this incident, according to what a little kid told him, referring to Officer Cho. Sovereign Yang agrees and tells him that this is certain even though Mount Hua has been weakened. He says that even though they have been weakened, it's impossible for just any random person to act against the martial laws of the planet, except they also have strong support from great people. Lee continues drinking his tea and tells the Sovereign that it seems that he will close his eyes to this, as if it never happened. Sovereign Yang's eyes suddenly widen as Lee's comment catches him off guard. He wonders how our hero can see right through him. Lee doesn't even look up and continues drinking his tea. The Sovereign also notices that he's so calm when they're talking about this incident, even though he's so young. He wonders who Lee actually is. He finally responds by saying that the most important thing for him is to ensure the survival of nearly 10,000 Mount Hua clan members, and he doesn't care if he has to throw away his pride to achieve that. It would seem that fighting back suddenly is not wise for his people's welfare. Sovereign Yang also mentions that Li doesn't seem nervous when he's talking to him. He mentions that after he reached the highest position, everyone always spoke to him with respect. But right now, Li's impolite attitude feels normal to him, which is really confusing. Li just tells him not to think too much about it, because it was his personal decision to live looking down on the world and everyone in it. He says that is how he chooses to live. That statement strikes Yang, who wonders if Li sees himself as the absolute supreme being, since he has decided to look down upon the world. The Sword Sovereign asks him who he really is. Our guy tells him that it's better for him not to know since he has decided to live with his eyes closed to such matters. He tells him to keep them closed because opening them just adds to the trouble. Sovereign Yang just looks at him, perplexed. This must be the oddest person he's met. Li leaves the table and heads outside. Before he leaves, he tells the Sovereign that he would like to ask something because he doesn't know much about the world in this era. He asks him if there is some sort of technology that can reconnect severed limbs. He confesses that the question sounds ridiculous, but he's been experiencing absurd things lately. Meanwhile, Hua Rin stands outside the room and looks at the scenery. The S-Devil ship is also seen to have left the Mount Hua planet and is now in space. Inside the ship, Seryung is seen unconscious and naked. She is seen inside some sort of life support system that helps her breathe and keeps her alive. Sunja stands nearby and monitors her vitals on the system. She continues to check her vitals, and it looks like it doesn't look good at all. Sunja steps out of the medical facility and returns to the other part of the ship. She is ambushed by Robert, who promptly asks her how the captain is doing. She bluntly tells him that the captain is not doing well. Robert asks her why and says all that she lost was an arm, which can be quickly stitched. The android tells her that the captain's blood is full of poison that her own body produced. The worst part is that the poison is unique and has no antidote. She says that she has tried to neutralize the poison as much as possible, but it's only further spreading into the internal organs. Robert starts to panic and lifts her up. He tells her that in that case, they need to go to the big hospital, and he asks her why they haven't left yet. Sunja tells him again that there's no antidote. Moreover, if they want to go to the big hospital, they have to go far away, like Kana and Nebula, and she's not sure the captain will survive the trip. Arbort unhands her and solemnly asks what can be done. Sunja just walks away and tells him that they need to prepare to say goodbye. She reminds him that the captain always said that they should attach a shield to her and throw her into space after her death because she wants to explore space forever. She says she'll gather some money so they can buy high-quality armor for the procession. Robert just stands there dejected, realizing what Sunja is implying. The usually vibrant ship looks quite dark and lonely. Sunja goes to the dispenser to get some water. She just looks into the cup, but it's not likely that she can drink it. She pours the cup of water on herself. The water streams down her head and onto her eyes. It seems to be the only way she can cry. Her eyes suddenly widen as she sees something out of the ordinary. Outside the ship, she sees a large ship that belongs to the West Heaven Sword Matron. She's alarmed because she doesn't know why the Sword Matron wants with them again. On the ship, the Sword Matron looks at the S-Devil ship. She looks pretty worried as she looks down at the ship, and it seems she's aware of the recent happenings. She continues to look at the ship, and it seems she'd like to speak with the bounty hunters. On the Mount Hua planet, Sovereign Yang notices something odd in the sky. The West Heaven Sword Matron's ship has suddenly entered into their planet, and it's unclear what she wants with them. The Sword Sovereign doesn't look so happy with what he's seeing, since this was an unexpected visit. The Mount Hua sect security enforcer, Man Sanjin, comes to inform him that the ship belongs to the West Heaven Sword Matron. The Sword Sovereign recognizes the West Heaven Sword Matron as Kim Yanhua. Sanjin tells her that they've tried to contact her several times, but there's been no response from the ship. Sovereign Yang tells him that it seems that she didn't come here to see him, so he tells him to let her be. Sanjin becomes extremely annoyed, so he tells the Sovereign that this is the territory of their sect. He adds that her position as the West Heaven Sword Matron doesn't give her the right to disregard and disrespect their sect. Sovereign Yang just smiles at him and tells him to clam down. He tells him that the Mount Hua sect is currently in the process of reconstruction and growth, so they need to avoid conflict with other sects at a time like this. It seems Sanjin isn't aware of the great calamity that just befell their sect. Sanjin tries to protest, but the Sword Sovereign tells him that patience is the strongest force their sect can wield right now. As he walks away, the Sovereign tell him that they must endure it, at least, until their sect is strong enough to fight back. Sanjin just stands there perplexed, but he has no choice but to obey the Sovereign's commands. He looks confused by the Sovereign's words, unsure of what he means that they're reconstructing. Meanwhile, the West Heaven Sword Matron's ship remains in the planet, and she doesn't give a response to the planet's security organization. Inside the ship, the Sword Matron tells Li that she came to seek an audience with him concerning a matter referring to him as the revered master. She says that it seems that she'd be able to offer him unexpected assistance. Inside the ship, it seems that the sword matron had retrieved Seryong's unconscious body from the S-Devil ship. She tells Lee that she can fix the girl that accompanied him at his request, referring to Seryong. Lee asks if she's saying that she can reattach her severed arm, and he wonders how far technology has advanced. The sword matron tells him that reattaching her arm is easy and is basic medical knowledge. She says the hardest part is removing the blood poison that's in her heart, that has spread throughout her body. Lee seems to be unaware of the poison in her heart prior to this time, and he mentions that it seems that Seryong is from the Sichuan Tang clan. He says it's no wonder that she's both foolish and hot-tempered. The sword matron commends his impressive knowledge and tells him that the blood poison in her heart is a secret technique of the Sichuan Tang clan only permitted for use by the clan's nobles. Our guy asks her how she knows about that. He eventually agrees with her and requests that she help him heal Seryong. The sword matron doesn't say anything, but just waits for him to respond to her previous statement. He adds that since he's received her requests, she can feel free to state her terms. He bluntly asks her what it is that she wants from him. The sword matron tells him that there is someone that she would like to meet, and she is sure he can open the way for her. Lee mentions that her voice is filled with killing intent, and it would seem that she's very angry. He mentions that, for some reason, he feels like she is talking about someone he has met before, referring to Rachel. He says that he met someone not too long ago who also made him want to beat him to death. He tells her that if that's the person she's after, she's already late because he's dead. The sword matron solemnly tells him that Rachel is still alive. She says the problem is that he's hidden himself in a much deeper place. He seems to be hiding in a place called the Galactic Nebula in the Vista Union system, particularly on the 108 Zuar 4H moon. She adds that this is the exact reason that she needs his help. Meanwhile, on the 108 Zuar 4H moon, there's a military droid disposal site that belongs to the human government's Southern Galactic Corp. A strange woman approaches a pod that's standing in the middle of the site. She brings a cloth that she plans to use to cover the person inside the pod. The woman patiently waits for the person to come out. The pod slowly starts to open, and a bright light is emitted from it. The pod continues to slowly open to reveal whoever is inside it. As the pod opens wider, the liquid inside it is displaced. It looks like something from Rachel's lab. The liquid spills on the ground and streams past the woman's bare feet. The pod completely empties its content, but whoever or whatever is inside is unclear because of the bright light. When she steps closer, a naked man crouches inside the pod. The man tries to cover himself up, and he seems to have been experimented on. The woman comes close to him and covers him up with the cloth in her hands. She congratulates him on his return to life and refers to him as the Count. Count Rachel looks at her perplexed, and he doesn't seem to know what is going on at all. He asks her who she is, and it seems like he doesn't recognize her. She introduces herself as Rachel Archimond, one of his vessels. The odd thing is that Rachel's surname is also Archimond. The weirder part is that this woman seems to be a splitting image of the West Heaven sword matron. She tells him to wait a little longer until all of his memories return. Rachel just looks at her, still confused as to what she's talking about. Rachel also stares at him and doesn't say anything. She says within herself that he'll love her again when he regains his memories. Meanwhile, the sword matron shows Lee the moon that Rachel is hiding on. She tells him that this is the place where the military disposes of their droids, and this must be where he is hiding. She says that the issue is that it's operated by the human government, so it's under the watch of the Planetary Defense Forces. Lee asks her if the human government is an official body. He also mentions that a child once told him the same thing, referring to Cho. The sword matron jokes that the term official body is a term that hasn't been heard in thousands of years. She mentions that he knows how to spark curiosity in people. She agrees that the human government is an official entity that has a distant but non-hostile relationship with the martial arts world. Lee remarks that this means that they don't get too close, but they don't stay too far either. He says that it looks like the habit of the elite to maintain their power hasn't changed. The sword matron glances over at him and wonders why he speaks like he's from thousands of years ago. She wonders who he is exactly. He tells her she can get straight to the point and ask what she wants him to do. Meanwhile, the planetary defense commander, Major Bernardo, looks out of his office window. The sword matron tells Lee that she would like him to help her divert the attention of the planetary defense forces so she can get to Rachel. Outside his office, Major Bernardo watches some work going on in a facility. He speaks to someone behind him and tells him that he has just received a report that the lab was completely destroyed. Behind him, Rachel sits down while Rachel stands behind him. He tells the commander that they encountered an unexpected problem. Rachel tells him that he had to erase the evidence since maintaining the secrecy of their project is top priority. The commander jokes that it seems like his tongue wasn't injured since he's able to speak quite smoothly. He asks him if his tongue will still work as well in front of the project investors. He says that the doubts that even one of his many lives will be enough to calm their anger once they find out that he destroyed the lab. Richel tells him that the project hasn't completely failed. He says the Steel City project is just a part of the project. Richel says that they've gathered enough data through experiments, so you could say that the project is a success. Richel adds that they will now proceed with the main project, which is the Iron Gangshi project, and proceeds to leave. Before he leaves, Major Bernardo stops him to ask a favor. He asks Richel if he can make another copy of the thing he has with him, referring to Rachel. Richel looks offended by the statement, but he doesn't turn around to show his displeasure. The commander adds that he's been stuck in the middle of nowhere for too long and he's getting bored. He says that if it's too hard to make a new one, he can just lend him his own for a few days. Richel tells him he'll consider it and heads out with Rachel. He looks sincerely annoyed by the request, but decides not to raise any dust. He thinks to himself how much of a piece of trash the commander is. The commander wonders why Richel is treating something that's not even human like a person, and considers it insolent. Meanwhile, in another place, it rains heavily. In this place, Seryung seems to be well again and equipped with her soft sword. She is drenched in the rain and just looks around absently. She wonders why her memories are so gloomy as the rain keeps beating on her. Suddenly, the sword matron shows up in front of her. The sword matron tells her that she seems like someone with a careless demeanor, but it turns out that she's been hiding behind a thick mask all this time, referring to her identity as a Sichuan Tang clan noble. Seryung just looks absent-minded and doesn't seem to understand what she's talking about. The sword matron tells her to follow her because she's come to take her. Seryung refuses and says she must protect the transference gate, which is right behind her. The sword matron tells her that this is not reality, but her delusion. She adds that she no longer has anything to protect. She tells Seryung that she has lost everything, and that's why she's trapped in her delusion, so she asks her to go back with her. Seryung angrily refutes and says she must protect the gate even if it costs her life because no one can pass through it. Suddenly, Seryung's eyes widen when something unexpected happens. The sword matron sticks her sword into her chest. Seryung looks at the sword in her chest in surprise. The sword matron tells her that she'd have to take her forcefully if she persists. Suddenly, Seryung wakes up in the tube on the sword matron's ship. She becomes conscious and tries to swim, wondering where she is. Later on, the sword matron goes to her charging terminal to recharge her internal energy drive after expending some energy to save Seryung. The system shows that her internal energy drive is recharging. 3.6 cycles have been recharged, and she's at 84%. Suddenly, Seryung steps into the room, and the sword matron asks her how she's feeling. Seryung doesn't talk for a while because it's a rare privilege to have a private audience with the sword matron. The sword matron tells her that her reattached arm will feel uncomfortable for a while, so she advises her to focus on rehabilitation until her neural network settles. Seryung thanks for saving her life and promises to repay the debt. The sword matron tells her that she's overestimating herself because debts are only shared between people of equal standing. Ouch. She tells her that regardless of her relationship with the Sichuan Tang family, she's invisible to even the side glances of her peers, which means she's quite small. She also adds that there was no reason to use up all her internal energy to save her. Seryung then asks her why she decided to save her if that is the case. She's only met with a reply that she's not qualified to ask that question either. The sword matron remarks that the Sichuan Tang family is really cruel to even cultivate the half-blood poison that was in her heart. She says that it was so hard to remove that she almost couldn't get it out. She looks into a nearby cup, where she kept the parasite responsible for the poison. She says that the rumors about the deadliest poison that is only passed down to the head of the Sichuan Tang family are true. Seryung becomes uncomfortable with the conversation concerning things that are personal to her clan and her past. She politely asks the sword matron to give her back the poison because it's her soul. Soon after, the system declares that the internal energy drive is fully charged. The sword matron removes the cables and tells her that she's already activated the half-blood poison when she chose death, which means she had abandoned the poison. She tells Seryung that it is no longer hers. Seryung just stares at her in despair, realizing she can't fight back or protest. The sword matron tells her that the poison has become hers, but much to Seryung's surprise, she tells her that she will give it to her. The sword matron says that in return, she would have to tell her everything that she knows about that man, and tells her not to miss a single detail. Seryung just stares at her and wonders who she's talking about. Her eyes suddenly flare open when she realizes she's talking about Li. Meanwhile, Li returns to the Manhwa planet to have a discussion with Sovereign Yang. The Sword Sovereign tells him that he wanted to meet him again to repay the kindness that they received, referring to him as the revered master. Li tells him to forget about it because he did it because he wanted to. He insists that a cup of tea is enough for him. The Sword Sovereign tells him that he understands that, but the roles of debtors and creditors are different. He also adds that the Mount Hua sect is not used to owing debts. Sovereign Yang says that he will repay the debt by offering sincere advice. He tells him not to get close to the West Heaven Sword Matron. He says that she is a venomous spider that lives in the deep, dark abyss. Meanwhile, Seryung leaves the room where she talked with the sword matron and heads out. On her way, she notices a strange figure by her side. When she glances to her side, she notices Elena, who is standing there, looking sad. The Sword Sovereign tells Lee that the Sword Matron infects everything that she comes near with darkness. Meanwhile, Seryung completely ignores Elena and walks past her, avoiding any trouble. Elena suddenly tells her not to be relieved that she survived because she'll die by her hands. This proves the Sword Sovereign's point that the matron infects everything she comes near, even her own flesh and blood. In the ship, Seryung asks Elena why she's threatening her. She asks if they have some sort of debt to settle and says she doesn't remember anything like that. Elena just tells her that the reason she's not come to settle their score is because her mother saved her. Both ladies just stare at each other in silence. Seryung finally walks away and says that she and her mother are really alike. Elena angrily tells her not to ignore her and reminds her that she will die by her hands. Seryung continues ignoring her and tells her whatever she says is fine. Before she leaves, the captain turns back to ask her a question. She turns back and faces Elena, who is paying rapt attention to hear her question. Seryung demands to know why she keeps speaking to her informally and asks her how old she is. Meanwhile, on the Manhwa planet, Lee thanks the Sword Sovereign for his advice, but tells him that he'll handle it his way. Sovereign Yang adds that he doesn't know the request that she made from him, but he knows that her true intention must be something else. He says that she's probably after someone significant to her. He tells Lee that there's a legend in Jianghu that says that any man who meets the West Heaven Sword Matron will never escape her grasp. This is because of the level of ideals she's after. He mentions that he had also come in contact with her in his younger years. She told him that she wanted to bear his child because a child born from their combined genes would be the most perfect being in this world. He says she was breathtakingly beautiful and radiant. He says that even though he was already engaged at that time, it was hard to refuse her. He confesses that even now, he still sometimes regrets rejecting her. Sovereign Yang says that rumor has it that over 100 men have succumbed to her. Meanwhile, Rachel steps into his facility on the moon in Nebula. The Sword Sovereign tells Lee that all these men provided her with their genes. In Rachel's lab, he takes a look at Rachel, who seems to be a replica of the Sword Matron that he created. He seems to have a sour look on his face, as the appearance of Rachel brings back some bad memories. The Sword Sovereign tells our hero that the Sword Matron always abandons these men after she takes their seed. He says this is why she was given the nickname Black Widow. Just like a Black Widow spider, she devours her mate after mating with them. Lee asks if that means that she has a lot of children. The Sword Sovereign affirms that she has over 100. Probably as many as the seeds she collected. Lee is shocked and asks if it's even possible for her to give birth to so many kids since she looks so young. Sovereign Yang tells him that's not how she has the children. He explains that she uses gene cultivation to create them in test tubes. With this method, she could even make 100 at once. Our guy is intrigued by the whole thing and he remarks that the world has really become strange. He asks the Sovereign why she decided to have so many children when raising children is not an easy task. Yang tells her that she's after the absolute one who will be a perfect being. She's doing it so she can achieve a dream she could never fulfill. But so far, she's never been able to create a copy that satisfied her. It seems that this is when humankind caught her eye. The Sovereign reminds him again to be careful because it is dangerous to get close to her. Lee remarks that this is such a shame and gets up after having his tea. The Sovereign is surprised and asks him what is a shame. Lee just walks away and says that it would have been nice if she were his type because he sometimes wishes he would have his own child. Sovereign just stares at him, unsure of what response to give to that. Meanwhile, Seryung returns to the ship and sees her men after a long time. Robert quickly grabs her, while Sunja grabs her leg. He exclaims upon seeing her and tells her he knew she'd survive and that he believed in her. Seryung asks him if he could step back for a minute because he's making her uncomfortable. He refuses and asks her why she would be uncomfortable when her comrades have missed her. They continue to hug her and fawn over her, but Lee just eats his hot dog as usual. She finally frees herself from their grip, and she tells Lee that she heard that he saved her. What an odd way of saying thank you. She comes closer and tells him she only has one question to ask him. She hesitantly asks him if he's older than her. Lee just looks confused and doesn't say a word. He's probably wondering what she's yapping about now. She answers her own question and says she knew it, because him not denying it is like a confirmation. She says he's older, probably like uncle older, or even grandpa older. She suddenly grabs the plate of hot dogs in front of him and tells him not to eat it anymore. She tells Sunja to bring him healthy organic food instead of instant food because of his health. Seryung tells Lee to put down the last piece of hot dog that's on his fork. He suddenly starts to awaken his martial form, and he tells her to back off if she doesn't want to die. Robert and Sunja just watch in confusion as both of them butt heads again. It seems Seryong is only able to express love through violence. Meanwhile, in the 32nd district of the Heavenly Demon Sect, Jong Ritak is shocked when he receives some new intelligence. He stammeringly asks the sword matron to repeat what she just said. She tells him that she got information about who Lee is. She says about 2,000 years ago, there was a man who voluntarily sealed himself in an underground stone chamber of the Mount Tai star system on Earth. She says his name is Lee Mokjin, and he's definitely related to the Heavenly Demon Sect. He says he got that part and asks her to repeat what she said next. She tells him that Lee called himself the Heavenly Demon Supreme. Yang almost has a stroke and his eyes widen from shock. Hey, don't forget to subscribe to my new channel.